Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Council briefing. I declare the meeting open at 6 p.m. and start by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Wadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to welcome all of the members of the public gallery here today. We do have a good audience this evening, so welcome to the meeting. But before we go to public question time, I'll just go to the CEO to see whether we have any declarations of interest.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. Through you, I've received two declarations of interest, financial interest from Councillor Toppelberg. The first relates to agenda item 5.5, scheme amendment number 5, the association being that the councillor's primary residence is within the proposed amendment area. Councillor Toppelberg is not seeking approval to participate in the debate or remain in the chambers or vote on the matter. The second from Councillor Toppelberg is in relation to item 6.3 on the commercial waste options paper. The association being that Councillor Toppelberg's business is within the City of Vincent and currently utilises the city's commercial waste service. So financial interest, Councillor Toppelberg is seeking approval to participate in the debate but not vote on the matter. That would be for next week's ordinary meeting of Council to consider.
Just in relation to that interest, CEO, could we please get some advice on whether that could be an interest in common or whether that would actually be a financial interest? If the declarer is happy with that question to be asked?
Happy, but I'm fairly sure I know the answer. But
okay, thank you.
Happy for it to be asked.
Thank you. Okay, we'll now go to public question time. So welcome members of the public gallery. This is your opportunity to address council. We do ask that you just state your name, the address that you reside in and the item that you're speaking to this evening. We do ask that you speak just for up to 3 minutes, and the CEO does time. As you can see, we've got quite a lot of people here this evening, so that is quite important, and please don't feel that we are specifically picking on you if we call you to time, because that is what we do to keep the meeting running. And we do just also ask that if you could please keep your comments respectful, that would be much appreciated. So there's no set order, it's just who would like to come to the mic tonight, so it's very valued, so thank you very much for that. I will now just, I think we can go straight to the items now. Oh no, sorry, the CEO has a couple of extra declarations of interest first.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Cole, I've received two disclosures of interest affecting impartiality from Councillor Loden. The first in relation to 8.7 on regarding Woodville Reserve. A number of members of Transition Town Vincent supported Councillor Loden's election campaign in October 2019, and one member is a relative. The second relates to item 5.6 on community sporting grants, the association being that Councillor Loden is friends with a member of the Leederville Tennis Club. Thank you.
Thank you, CEO. So what we often do when we have members of the public here who are interested in hearing councillors ask questions of administration is we do go to those items that were first raised by members of the public gallery. And just to explain at this briefing, this is a question and answer between council members and the administration, and that the decision making and debate does happen next Tuesday night. So the first item that was raised this evening was item 5.5, which is amendment number 5 to local planning scheme number 2, outcomes of advertising. So council members just calling for questions on this item. I think I had questions, so I'll just, if you can bear with me. No other council members? Okay. Am I asking these of you, Manager of Policy in Place? Yes? Okay. So I just wanted to ask with where we've got to with this amendment and the recommendation to not proceed, is there any risk to maintaining the current provision in the local planning scheme of 2 dwellings per lot, given that this now has to go through an approval process?
Through you, Mayor Cole, so the proposal to not proceed with the amendment needs to be forwarded to the Planning Commission and ultimately a decision made for the Minister of Planning. The City has met with officers at the Department of Planning and in putting together this report, and understands that they're generally supportive of what's proposed. So I would say on that basis we've minimise the risk as much as possible, though would note that it ultimately does come down to a decision that the Minister would make.
Thank you. And just in relation to the outstanding issue of 6 Burt Street, what's the status there and how will that be resolved?
Through you, Mayor Cole, so there's an existing development approval for the site at 6 Burt Street for the short stay accommodation, thank you. That approval will still stand until the applicant proposes an amendment to that application or separately looks to amend the scheme themselves.
Are you aware of how they intend to proceed? Like, would they be looking at a rezoning application or a scheme amendment for that site?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we have met with the applicant earlier this year, the planning consultancy earlier this year, and I think that they're still considering their options.
The CEO is prompting me to mention at this point that I'm a member of the WA Planning Commission, but I believe that this would go to the Statutory Planning Committee and not to the WA PC, in which I'm a member. Yep. Just one more question in relation to character retention in the area, just noting that we're currently dealing with Mount Hawthorn, that we're then in relation to administration's feedback in relation to the motions to the AGM. It talked about Cleaver Precinct, and then it does talk in this report about moving to character retention potential in this area. What sort of time frame would administration see that happening within?
Through you, Mayor Cole, so once we complete the demonstration project in Mount Hawthorn, we're looking at an option to essentially go through that similar process of inviting all of the streets who we identified in the character retention study to see what community willingness there is to participate in that process, so that we can get a better understanding of how we might be able to more efficiently introduce character retention areas to streets that are receptive to it. So I would say at the completion of the Mount Hawthorn project, which I think is at the end of this financial year, around that sort of time frame.
Thank you, councillors. Any further questions on 5.5? Okay. The next item raised was 5.3, which is number 17 Florence Street, West Perth, proposed for multiple dwellings and alterations and additions to 8 existing multiple dwellings. Questions on this item? Councillor Loden?
Just a clarification for the question that was raised from the floor there around the distinction between it being a multiple dwelling versus a group dwelling. What would need to change in the development to change it from a multi-dwelling to a group dwelling, as the applicant is suggesting?
Through you, Mayor Cole, there's a clear definition included in the officer's report to council that sets out the multiple dwellings as it is defined under the R codes. Ultimately, it refers to any portion of a dwelling being above another portion of a dwelling. So in terms of the definition itself, it doesn't specify, it's not neat as in terms of specifying you need to have these certain functions or services and that would constitute a dwelling. That would make it quite simple. That's not the case. So ultimately, what would need to happen is, as opposed to 2 separate spaces for accommodation and independent living, which is currently proposed, one above the other, there would need to be greater integration between the 2 floors. Now, I refer to the front entrance, and that is the only space which is common. Aside from that, everything else works independently. So ultimately, there needs to be greater integration and arrangement of the floors so that they form one dwelling as opposed to 2.
And this discussion has been had with the applicant and explained and so forth?
Through you, Mayor Cole, this issue has been raised a number of times throughout the assessment process, as well as in the DRP meetings itself. That's included in the minutes from the DRP. That's before you. So this isn't a new issue. Ultimately, we have gone through the process because there is an opportunity for the applicant to have made modifications that would have resulted in the development being group dwellings as opposed to multiple dwellings. So we didn't cease consideration of that aspect of the proposal up front because, again, it's not clear cut and you can work through this issue, but ultimately the proposal before you still represents multiple dwellings, which is prohibited.
And am I correct that the applicant would have the opportunity to withdraw this application and make modifications and resubmit, given the proposal being currently for refusal? Obviously, Council hasn't made a decision on that, but that option is still available to them?
Through you, Mayor Cole, there's a number of pathways moving forward, that being one of them, an alternate being a request from the applicant to defer consideration of the application, and in that way it wouldn't be a withdrawal of the application. I guess they would have an opportunity to make further modifications and work together with the city as well as the city's design review panel to reach an outcome where this component of the development could be contemplated rather than a straight prohibition.
Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. A few questions, if I may. So what's currently proposed are, and let's leave the modifications to the existing multiple dwellings to the side, but what's been proposed by the applicants as group dwellings is 2 3-bedroom, 3.5 bathroom plus study, 2 living area, 1 kitchen and 1 kitchenette in each. Is that correct? Is that a fair summation of what's proposed in the drawings?
Through Mayor Cole, yes, and there's a laundry on the ground floor.
Correct. Sorry, that's 3.5 bathroom, but the half is half laundry, half bathroom. So in the event that this was accepted as group dwellings and approved, and there were no internal modifications made, and the city was of the view through whatever compliance method, someone made a complaint, for example, that they believe they were being separately lived in, who is the onus on to prove that it's being lived independently, and what is available to the city in the event that it was approved, for example, as group dwellings? What actually happens? Does the use cease? What would actually happen at that point if it was approved as the applicant has applied for it?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the definition of a dwelling refers to 6 unrelated people potentially living in a dwelling. So if there was a complaint received, should this be approved in its current form, and council was satisfied that this was a group dwelling, then subsequently, if there was a complaint allegedly being used for other than a group dwelling, administration would investigate the matter. It would be on administration to gather the evidence. Now, it would need to demonstrate that more than 6 people unrelated are potentially living in that dwelling. But I have to stress that by virtue of authorising this development in its current form, you would need to be satisfied that it is a group dwelling.
So but the use. So I understand about the 6 people, but if there were 2 people only, one upstairs, one downstairs, completely unrelated, utilising it, their own kitchen, their own bathroom, separate entrances, etc. Had it been approved, and that would, even if it was functioning in that way, it would still be considered a group dwelling because it was approved as a group dwelling. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that would be my understanding, yes.
And under the planning framework, whose responsibility is it to define what is? I understand the definition, obviously, of multiple dwelling, and I understand the applicant is presented as group dwelling. Whose responsibility is it? Up to the decision maker? Is it up to the city as the planning authority? Who actually makes the determination as to what it? They can apply. You can put whatever title onto it that is chosen. Is it actually the city's responsibility to determine what it is?
Through you, Mayor Cole, under the city's local planning scheme, Clause 18 refers to land uses, defines land uses, and there's a zoning table about permissibilities. Ultimately, in considering a development application, the city would need to classify the proposal and align it to a defined land use. Now, in some instances, it's unlisted, but in this case, there's a clear definition of multiple dwellings that the proposal fits within, and on that basis, that would be the land use that would need to be determined.
So, two more questions. If, for example, the kitchenette facility was deleted from the ground floor, which currently just shows no space for a fridge but just a hot plate and a sink as far as I can tell, if that was to be deleted, would it be open to the city to determine this as being a multiple dwelling given there's no facility proposed to be able to cook and prepare food within the ground floor?
Through you, Mayor Cole. Possibly. Again, it's not as clear-cut as that. There have been other SAT decisions where it's not essential to have those certain facilities, and it's still of the view that they could operate as independent living areas. So we would need to see the proposal and also the arrangement and how that would function ultimately. So we'd need to work through that detail.
And the last question is just for clarity. Whilst the development application has been put forth for the modifications to the multiple dwellings and the construction of 2 new group dwellings, the officer's assessment and the advice and the determination we are making is actually whether or not this is considered multiple dwellings or group dwellings, because no assessment has been made because the city has deemed that they are multiple dwellings. So that's actually the question we're being asked, is are these multiple dwellings or not? Not is the dwelling, because in the event... Yeah, so I guess that's my question, is that's actually what's being asked, not to assess the application that was actually put forth because the city has deemed them to be a different dwelling type and therefore not capable of being determined because they are multiple dwellings. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole, there's 2 components of this development. One is for a prospective multiple dwellings, new building to the rear, and then the second component of this application is for the alterations and upgrade of the existing multiple dwellings. An assessment has been undertaken of the alterations of the existing multiple dwellings. The outcome of that being some of the reasons for refusal, but ultimately the first component of the prospective or new multiple dwellings to the rear, you would need to form your view around. It is ultimately forming a view as to whether it is multiple dwellings. But if you were of the view that, or if council was of the view that it was group dwellings, then there would be potential to consider that.
Councillors, questions? Manager, just following up on the comment from the applicant in relation to having the ability to consider moves towards dual occupancy. Do you have any comment in relation to that, and whether Design WA or our policies consider that issue as that sort of flexible living arrangement and flexi house, as people sometimes like to refer to it?
Through you, Mayor Cole, diversity of housing is accepted generally. Now, ultimately, a dual key arrangement could be contemplated in the right locations. In this particular area, for this site, there is a prohibition against multiple dwelling. So if it is in the form of multiple dwelling, then in this location it's not appropriate.
It's a very definitive answer, thank you. And the other question I just had is that from my reading of the report in relation to Design WA applying to the existing building, the issues that administration are raising are really not commenting on the design of the existing building but on the additions of the parking and the storerooms. Is that correct? Because I think there's some commentary around the fact that Design WA can't apply to current buildings, and I don't believe my reading of the report doesn't suggest that the administration is trying to apply Design WA to the existing building itself, but only to the additions and alterations around that. Is that a fair assessment?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, it's to the extent of the upgrades.
Yep. Okay. Any further questions on this development? Okay. We will then move on. The next item raised was 6.2, Car Street Bike Lane consultation. Questions? Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. So in the report, which I note changed name in the supplementary agenda from consultation results to bike network improvements. In the report on page 7, it says that to refresh the cycle lanes in their current format would cost in the order of $5,000, including bike symbols, etc., and to paint the lanes green would cost $90,000. And we're later told that I think there's a reference to it being pretty much the same amount for getting a lesser result. Just confirming that the total cost, if the city was of the view, or council was of the view, to just improve the existing bike lanes to the best standard possible, which would include painting them fully, that the total cost would be $95,000. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct.
Thank you. And did we ever get to the bottom of the 615 letters that seem to have only been received by a few people? Because it seems that residents who have a keen interest are adamant that they didn't receive the notification. I know whilst it was mentioned it was around Christmas time, it was mid-November, it was well and truly outside of what would be considered a holiday period. Did we ever investigate how the letters were distributed and confirm that they were actually delivered to those addresses?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole. Obviously, we faithfully attempted to deliver those letters. I can't explain why some people did not receive them, but we did print and faithfully deliver the 600 and something outlined in the report.
I'll talk a bit more next week about occupancy and the statistical side of it, because I don't really have questions, I've just got more comments about those matters. Just in terms of, there was some comment made by Ms Sorensen about, which I assume is anecdotal, about Cleanaway having issues currently with access, and that they are not pleased about the prospect. I assume people have been speaking to their local waste collection service people. Have we had any feedback from our contractor in relation to access on Carr Street, and have we discussed the proposal with them at all? And if we haven't, can we please, by either phone call or email, get some feedback from them prior to the briefing notes being issued?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I can't speak for Cleanaway because I've not got that information, but I can check in the next few days. But certainly our own waste team, we collect one of the bins, are happy with the design, and that's the comment in the report.
Councillors, Councillor Fotakis.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to the Director. Just looking at the parking report that comes through, what weight or any consideration that's given to other parking areas, say for example Stewart Street, because obviously it's just across Fitzgerald Street, so what weight or even consideration, if we've got any data on the usage of those bays as well, would be helpful.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I can check that in the next couple of days as well.
Councillor Castle. Through you, Mayor, to the Director. I just have a question about the number of parking bays that we think might be required by the residents. Do we have information, or can we get that in the briefing notes, about how many of the properties on these stretches have off-street parking available, or have had approvals that include visitor bays within their property, or how many perhaps are relying on on-street parking for their own, not for visitors but for residents?
Through you, Mayor Cole, again, I can see what information we have in the next few days to answer that question.
Councillors. Councillor Hallett.
Just a couple about parking. We received, and perhaps you didn't, some of the images around cars parking outside of the lined bays. What's the process for responding to that kind of thing, or managing it? I assume that it's not entirely individual bays marked, and it's more just a line of cars, so different sized cars will fit differently. Can I also ask about the the stats around the occupancy and the number of times that it was 80% or more, what would normally be our response to occupancy rates that are that variable when we've looked at other traffic studies from 30% to 80% or 90% at different times of the week, and what would we normally do around an area that has 80% occupancy, and what parking capacity was approved for the Orthodox Church beyond the car parks that they've got on site.
Through you, Michael. Councillor Hallett referred to the pictures. I've obviously just seen them. They look like illegal parking to me. That's a simple procedure. Our rangers can enforce that. Residents can contact our rangers, or we can patrol the area if it's a regular occurrence, so we can deal with that. As far as the question about over 80% occupancy, it's a difficult question to answer directly because that does depend on the specific circumstances, and obviously we are currently waiting for our integrated transport plan, which is to guide what action we take in terms of parking and occupancy, etc. So that's a difficult answer to give, and I can check some of the information about the Orthodox Church as well.
Could I just follow up on that question? So because you're still going, Councillor Hallett? Oh, different. Just in relation to that question about parking occupancy, we have had a measure where 85% is something that we note where intervention occurs, and I think it would be helpful. I was just looking through our policies because I'm trying to remember. I might ask one of the manager for development and design. Can't keep up. Where we have our occupancy levels and our suggested interventions, I think that this was a body of work commissioned some time ago, and it will ultimately be updated through the ITP, but I think it was a Donald Veal consultancy special, and I think that it would probably be helpful if perhaps policy in place could review the occupancy data with that view, similar to when we looked at the streets in North Perth when we were looking at parking interventions. Do you know where I'm coming from? Yes. So could that potentially happen between here and the meeting and be provided in the briefing notes? Yep, thank you. Sorry, Councillor Hallett, thank you.
And just wondering if you could include the 2013 bike network plan either by email or in the briefing notes, so we can see, I guess, the broader context of east-west links and things that this is proposed to fill.
Through your call, we can do that.
Councillor Loden.
One of the questions raised was around increased safety concerns when you're exiting your property, and I was wondering if administration could provide a response to that query.
Through your call, I believe some of that commentary is in the report already, that's not seen as a major issue. I understand the residents' concern, but what I can do is get some additional information and put that in the report before next week.
Councillors, Councillor Castle.
Through you, Michael, I just have a couple more questions. The first relates to the design that's proposed. I'm just wondering if you can give us some more information about why the bike paths are proposed to go in between the car bays and the verge, as this perhaps not the usual arrangement, and it's been raised in the gallery that might contribute to some of those safety concerns in terms of backing out of their driveways. Is there a particular reason why it's been designed that way?
Yeah, through you, Michael. That is the current standard design, and that's so that parking cars don't cross the bike lane to park.
And my second question is, and perhaps this will be clear when we see the bike plan and other information in the briefing notes, is were any other east-west pathways or roads considered if this was to not be approved? What other options would there be for connectivity?
Through your call, I'll take that on notice and provide additional information next few days.
Councillor Loden.
just in the context of the question around what we would typically do if we're in a location where occupancy is already over 85%, what is the current parking restrictions along that stretch of road, if any?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'd better take that question on notice rather than give an incorrect answer.
And then also in that context, can we just be clearer about, with those lost bays, what that occupancy rate would be if those cars were trying to find a parking space at that time? And I don't know how you can do this, so we'll see. I'll ask the question anyway. Is there any way to tell who the people are that are parking in those bays? I assume it's predominantly residents, but is there other things around that area that are potentially using those bays?
Through my call, I'll take that question on notice and see what information we have.
Councillor Gonchevsky.
One more for the unnoticed batch, I suspect, just in relation to where we've implemented protected on-road bike lanes in other areas, whether there's been any complaints received or notifications put forward to the city in relation to accidents or, car B cyclists within the bike lane from the residents that are on those streets and are needing to access the street and cross the bike lane to get to the road.
Through you, Cole, I will take that one on notice.
Councillors. Director, I do have a number of questions. I just wanted to seek confirmation that the total number of responses received both during public consultation and after, including all the emails that the city has received, total 34. Is that the total of all submissions, whether they were in or out of public advertising period?
Yes, McCall, that's correct. We included, irrespective of the time limit, we included all comments, and that's in the report.
Thank you. I also just wanted to ask in relation to the Car Street section of the north side where the cycle lane, where there's no parking, is it possible to get an understanding of where houses, how many houses along that part have no on-site car parking?
So, McCall, I'm sure we can do something to help with that question, so I'll take that question on notice.
Thank you. And just in relation, West End Deli has been mentioned, and my understanding is that that's just outside of this area, looking on the plan and the map of Cleaver Precinct. In terms of occupancy, I note that it's looking at the affected areas but not parking bays further down Carr or Strathcona Street. Has there been any submission or view put forward from West End Deli about impact on customers, given, noting this is outside of the area?
Yeah, through you, Michael. I think the report mentions West End Deli, that they didn't provide a response, but I can check that and I'll provide that in the notes.
Thank you. And just in relation to there seems to be some confusion around permits for some of the residents. Has there been an issue with permits around 26 Carr Street? I know that was mentioned this evening.
Yeah, yes, Michael. I believe from memory that that unit doesn't qualify for some of the permits. Again, I can check that and provide that in the notes just to confirm that. I think that's just the policy because of when the unit was built. In other words, the parking was meant to be contained on the development site. That's my understanding.
Okay, and just reiterating my earlier question about really going through the parking occupancy data and actually breaking it down in relation to the sort of interventions that the city would look at certain levels. My understanding has always been that 85% is a key percentile when it comes to parking.
Yes, we make hold. So between the two directors, we'll provide some commentary to help elected members. And
also just perhaps some additional commentary around safety, because there have been a lot of concerns raised this evening around safety, particularly with backing out, etc. So I think it would be useful to have some additional information on that. Yep. Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. The question was half asked from the gallery, maybe in a different way, so I'll ask it. The question was essentially asked, where are these bike lanes going from and to? Given that the city, so if you take, for example, the investment that's already been made in infrastructure on Bulwer Street, and given that the city owns pretty much all of the land on the north side of Vincent Street does own between Morrison and Charles Street, I'm trying to work out, and I understand the east-west connection, I understand there's issues in relation to connecting Leederville, for example, and Newcastle Street has 2 lines painted down that aren't officially bike lanes because they weren't allowed to be so. But if we can just get some clarity in terms of the bike plan or bike network, where these bike lanes are intending to take people from and to, perhaps the projected volumes or the current volumes, and just some justification as to why Carr Street Carr and Florence is the best possible route to get people from wherever A and B happen to be on that route, understanding that once you get onto that there are plenty of north-south options now as you move through, certainly past Stewart Street from into Palmerston, but just if we can get some clarity around that intent and why that route as opposed to anywhere else, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, through my call, we can do that.
I just was going to add to that. That has been outlined in writing in the report, but it might be good to have a visual map of some of the way in which the infrastructure links, because that has been discussed in the report. But I think visually that might be useful, and perhaps that's already in the bike plan. But I think in terms of Shakespeare, etc., that wouldn't be. Any other questions on the bike lanes? Okay, thank you. The next item raised was 6.1, which is the response to petition requesting the relocation of parking on Turner Street, Highgate, adjacent Jack Marks Reserve. Questions? Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. So Mr. Seeley made a comment about the exclusion of people's views who didn't live on the street. My understanding is that certainly our inbox and the chamber is open to people's contribution from wherever and whenever. But am I correct that any responses that were received that weren't from Turner Street residents were responses received? And if they were, what actually happened to those?
So through you, Michael, if I explain the logic, obviously the city received the petition, which was primarily from users of the park, not residents, which was presented to council. And in response to that report, administration said that we didn't feel that we had the view of residents on the street, because when you looked at the petition, the vast majority were people who used the park, but they weren't residents. So the council decision at that time was to consult the residents. So in that way, you've got the view of the people who use the park from the petition, which were in favour of flipping the parking, and we sought the views of the residents to add to that information. So that's what we did. That's what this exercise was. But you're right. Some people managed to get the link, so they lived outside Turner Street, and they also contributed to this consultation. And you'll find in the report that for the purposes of the summary, they were excluded because they did not live in Turner Street, and the council decision was to consult people on Turner Street. So we have those responses. There's no problem providing them, but they're not reviewed in the report, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so as I say, my understanding, I'm happy and trust in council's ability to filter those, but if they can be provided, if the responses have been provided, would appreciate them being provided to us in the briefing notes, if that's okay.
Yeah, through my call, we can do that. We have them. That's not a problem.
Councillors? Councillor Fotakis.
Through you, Mayor, I just want to refer back to, it's just a comment by Mr. Seeley on the calculation and the number of the car bays, that there being a miscalculation. So I just wanted, through you, Mayor, to get the Director's comments on that.
Yeah, through you, Nicole. Mr. Seeley does live on Turner Street and received a consultation and did approach administration about miscalculation. Having said that, we did not mention in the consultation letter the change in number of parking spaces. We just provided some plans, so you've had to measure the plans and work out the difference in parking spaces, which obviously Mr. Seeley did. You'll find on page 5 of the report the paragraph and the consultation, the final two paragraphs, we deal with that issue there, that we did agree with Mr Seeley that we were showing some bays that are no longer present because of a development. So that's dealt with. There's a little change in the number of bays.
Can I just ask a follow-up to that question? So the report says that there would be 5 additional bays from changing to the south side of the street. Mr Seeley believes that would actually be 7, I think. 8, sorry. So he's saying a further 3. Would that mainly be from changing from the site from the north to the south where the park is, or is that sort of distributed wherever the additional bays are? Is that distributed across the south side, or would that be predominantly around the park?
That's what you might call difficult to explain. The error, if you like, is not in the number of parking bays that we said you could fit alongside the park. It was the number of parking bays that we said were in the current design, where the parking is outside people's houses. So that's the error. So there's no change in the number of parking bays provided. The manager of engineering has been on site and measured, and he says there's an additional 5 spaces using Australian standards. So there may be a disagreement between us and Mr Seeley on that, but that's what we say. But that is different to the original report where we said there were additional 3 bays. We now accept there's an additional 5 by moving the parking.
Okay, I do understand, but I'm just saying that where do those additional car bays come in when compared to the north side? Is it predominantly on the park because of lack of crossovers? Is that the main issue?
Yeah, so if I misunderstood my call, yeah, that's absolutely correct. There's a lack of crossovers on the park side, so you fit in extra spaces.
Thank you. Councillor Fotakis?
Thank you, Mayor. And through Mayor to the Director, when we're looking at, I'm not too sure whether it's Director of Planning can answer this as well. We're talking about extra bays. What are we talking about in terms of extra cost to the city with taxes and charges and car parking levies?
Through my call, I think I can answer that. There is no paid park in this area, so the extra bays make no difference in that respect.
Councillors, any further questions? Okay, we'll move on. Just my piece of paper. The next item raised by a member of the public gallery this evening was 5.1, which is number 15 Leake Street, North Perth, proposed 3 aged or dependent persons dwellings. Questions, please? No questions? Councillor Castle?
Sorry, I was trying to remember if you had asked this question or answered the question during public question time. Through you to the Director, how will we be able to ensure that this is used as an aged dependent person's dwelling rather than a group dwelling, as has been questioned in the public gallery? What, if it's approved for that particular use, what mechanisms do we have?
Through you, Mayor Cole, there is a ARCO deemed to comply standard that specifically deals with this matter. Where an aged or dependent person's dwelling is approved, there needs to be a Section 70A notification on the title to warn prospective purchasers of their obligations to comply with specific terms, being that you need to be an aged or dependent person or the surviving spouse of that person. So that is what, from a planning perspective, would be imposed. In terms of ensuring that occurs, ultimately it would be complaints driven. If there was a complaint raised with the city, then that would be investigated and compliance action could be taken for not complying with the terms of your approval.
And my second question is, there were a number of amendments made to the plans and they were re-advertised, and then on my reading it was went back to the design review panel and more amendments were made. Was that final revision re-advertised or sent to submitters before this report was prepared?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the final set of changes were not provided to submitters before being presented to Council for consideration. Ultimately, no greater departures were being created, which did not warrant formal re-advertising. Ultimately, changes were made to address the Design Review Panel members' comments to improve the design outcome.
Councillors, Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. A few questions. Proposed condition 11.2 refers to any aged or dependent person dwelling must be designed and used only for the permanent accommodation of a person who, and then 11.2.2 talks about has a recognised form of disability, etc. May also accommodate the spouse or carer of that person, and in any case no more than one other person. The way the condition is worded, it refers to a person. Obviously the intent, as has been presented, is for this to be more than a person. Is there any issue with the language in the way in which the condition is written in terms of the occupancy that's proposed?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, there is an issue, and that needs to be reviewed. Thanks for pointing that one out. Subtle, but it is singular as it is currently written. When under the R-Code's definition, it's framed to be at least one person. So administration will review that after briefing.
Okay, so, and I understand that the applicant has made submission in relation to their personal circumstances, and I've made some comments to them, and I also understand that whilst that circumstance is understood, that the actual application refers to the use and what's proposed, and that there's no mechanism for them or the city being bound to that intended use or for those intended persons. So just on that issue of the number of people, the R-Codes contemplates aged, or let's leave aged to the side, but dependent persons' dwellings, or aged or dependent, as being able to accommodate aged or dependent persons and another person. So is there anything in the current application that would preclude, in the 3 dwellings proposed, having in each of the 3 bedrooms, having an aged or dependent person and a carer or a spouse or another partner or another person in each of the bedrooms, or is it only per dwelling? So I guess the question is, there's currently 9 bedrooms proposed on the site. Is there anything precluding 18 people from living on the site under the R-Codes?
Through you, Mayor Cole, ultimately it is an aged or dependent person's dwelling referring to still the 6 unrelated people, so you would still be capped at the 6 for each of those dwellings, irrespective of the makeup of that. So, okay, so that's fine. That's in relation to another officer's comments. That's understood, I should say. The officer's comments in relation to, I'll get to, sorry, excuse me for a moment. I'll come back to landscaping in a sec, but the officer comments that relate to the submissions around the plot ratio being representative of potentially being overdevelopment. The officers have said that whilst the development exceeds the deemed to comply, it provides open space, street setbacks and lot boundary setbacks compliant with the deemed to comply. This indicates it would not constitute an overdevelopment and would result in excessive building bulk and scale as viewed from the street or adjoining properties. There's a shortfall in landscaping, and there's been significant concern expressed by the DRP in terms of the actual livability of the spaces internally, particularly outside of the bedrooms. Is only for the 3 bedrooms, and as the applicant has proposed, there'll be 3 independent people living, but the living and dining space is has been commented on by the DRP as being tight, or there's some concerns there. Would those factors not indicate that potentially that at least there is conjecture about whether or not it's overdevelopment of the site, as indicated by the plot ratios being 20%, an average of 20% greater than what's allowed for the age independent person dwellings? Through you, Mayor Cole, there could be differing views based on whether this does constitute an overdevelopment of the site. The rationale of landscaping together with some of the dwelling spaces being tight, in addition to one visitor bay not being available on site for units 2 and 3, I could see how a person could arrive that this development is overdevelopment. I'm less convinced that that's the case on the basis of what is set out in the report, being they still do provide open space and street setbacks and lot boundary setbacks that do comply with the deemed to comply. So I don't think it's as easy as saying due to those other departures it represents overdevelopment. I think we need to consider it based on its own merits. For instance, the lack of a visitor parking bay on site, that could actually be provided in the absence of a communal open space, which the applicant is providing. It's not a requirement for the R codes, but that would provide greater amenity, I guess, for the occupant. So it's around what is being delivered, and we need to consider it on its own merits.
Okay, I'll have to wait for next week for that one. The owner of number 17 spoke about, so if we just go to page 29 of the report, which shows the upper floor plans, and particularly for proposed units 2 and 3, where there is the 230 mil wide boundary wall that separates those two dwellings, extends out, and they have specifically asked for that to be removed because for them that increases the bulk and scale. Is there any reason, engineering or architecturally or otherwise, that you can see why that wouldn't be something that could be contemplated? I understand the applicant in their submission said they are prepared to consider other changes, but in the event that this were to be approved, is there any engineering reason why that extra fin would be required?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'm not an engineer by trade, so stemming on from briefing, we can discuss that with maybe the building team. But my understanding is that it is a blade wall for architectural purposes and probably to delineate between the two units, and that does carry through from the front of the development as it presents to Leake Street. So it's probably for continuity of design, but separate. We can discuss with the building services team in terms of whether there's any need for that, and also liaise with the applicant because it's been put forward and see that acceptance of deleting that because ultimately it is that proposal, so we can provide that in briefing note.
Thank you. Just want to ask about landscaping and functionality as well. So if we assume that the accessible path that is determined to the level entrance is the path from Leake Street, and let's take Unit 2 for argument's sake. You arrive on Leake Street and the proposed communal courtyard, as I'll talk about landscaping, or ask about landscaping in a sec, there's these retractable screens that are proposed to be. I'm wanting to know who operates the screens, who has control over them, how do they operate, are they remote controlled, are they motion censored, who actually decides when those screens come out and for what purpose? Is it to protect the privacy of the person in Unit 1, Unit 2, if you want to access past there to get to the level entrance? So whilst technically it does provide the pathway as you go past the 30 centimetres of box hedge to get into the dwelling, I'm just curious with that retractable screen, how that actually meets the intent or requirement, because it doesn't present as an unimpeded access to the property, depending upon who would actually have control over what that screen is there for.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'll take that on notice and liaise with the applicant to better understand the details of that and how it would function.
Okay, and I'll talk to it more next week, but just so that I'm clear, the applicant proposed deciduous trees in what is the communal courtyard, which were crepe myrtles, and the upper floor of Units 2 and 3 overhang and provide a veranda or an awning, I suppose, over the part of the outdoor living area for Units 2 and 3. And the city's parks team recommended an evergreen, which is the magnolia, to be planted, or two of them to be planted in that area. Is that correct? That's a recommendation that's come from the city to the applicant, that they plant evergreens in that location?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that is correct.
And the applicant talks about a detailed landscaping plan, including grassed areas and other areas. Can we get some indication, either from our parks team or someone from the DRP who's skilled in the area of landscape design, as to how and where grass would actually grow in that area, given that there are proposed to be 2 6-metre wide canopy evergreen trees planted in the communal courtyards?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that can be arranged, yep.
Are you still asking questions, Councillor Toppelberg?
I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Councillor
Thank you.
Konchevsky.
I just have a question in relation to. I note that the visitor bay is for one unit rather than communal. Just in relation to parking on Lake Street, given that it's time restricted, what, if any, access would the dwellings have to parking permits as part of this development?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's a great question. I'll take that on notice and provide that in briefing notes.
One more question.
So I do have one more.
You promise it's one more.
It is one more. You mentioned earlier that the applicant would be able to provide the compliant visitor bay in lieu of the communal outdoor space. Would that what's shown in the plans as courtyard has dimensions of where are we? Well, there's two elements of it shown, but they're small. that sit in the laneway. They effectively have a black pool type fence shown in plan in the courtyard space, and they're shown in the landscaping plan as having significant landscaping or a significant planter adjacent to the window. Would those courtyards be compliant as private outdoor space if the communal outdoor space wasn't there? I'm still confused about the retractable awnings, but just in terms of what outdoor space each dwelling actually has access to, does it comply without the communal outdoor space?
Through you, Mayor Cole, as per the detailed assessment table, outdoor living areas do comply. The extent of the departure for outdoor living areas is for Unit 1, and that outdoor living area being located in the front setback area.
Have we concluded questions on this item? Councillor Wallace.
Sorry, I just had one more question about the plot ratio area. Are they receiving a bonus to the allowable plot ratio area because it's an aged or dependent person's dwelling above what would otherwise be acceptable in the area?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's not so much a bonus. Ultimately, there's a concession granted through the R codes in terms of the lot areas to accommodate aged or dependent persons' dwellings. Separate to that, in terms of the built form outcome, the applicant has sought to increase the amount of floor area, 100 square metres being the deemed to comply standard, and they're seeking in the order of 120 square metres. So it's not so much a bonus, but it's a discretion being sought by the applicant. And though it doesn't satisfy deemed to comply, I guess a judgment needs to be made about the acceptableness of that.
Councillors? Okay, we'll move on. The next item raised was 5.2, which is number 12, Newcastle Street, Perth, proposed third-party digital billboard sign. Questions, please? Councillor Hallett.
Just a quick one, probably for the briefing notes. Just wondering how many stories would have been allowable on the site when the current development was originally applied for and built?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that can be provided in the briefing notes.
Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. A couple of questions. Poor Mr De Florio seems to always pick an agenda where it's got 500 items on it and has to sit here for 3 hours to hear his. So just a question, if an existing... So the officers have defined this as a billboard under the policy. There's conjecture from the applicant. But given that the officers are defining this proposal as a billboard, does this mean that the existing billboards in the city, which are effectively non-conforming uses, but they have rights to exist because they predated the city's policy, if somebody wished to remove a sign that is a current static sign and replace it with an identical sized sign that was a digital sign, would that be acceptable under the city's policy?
I'm just going to query whether a digital sign could be the same as a flat, static billboard.
Exactly, that's the question that's being asked. because the applicant has defined it as something different. Our officers have said that it effectively is a billboard. So what I'm asking is if someone has rights to have a billboard currently, if they were to replace it with a non-static version, would that be acceptable to the city's officers?
Through you, Mayor Kyle, I'll take that on notice.
Okay. And given the unique circumstances of the applicant actually being within the building, the issue is that it's considered third-party signage, but they have put forth that it is actually a visual display for their business or otherwise. The policy, because it hasn't contemplated it, is silent upon that. But I guess is that just open to council discretion to determine whether it meets that element of the policy, and that regardless of what's actually been displayed on the screen, the existence of the screen and the images that it's showing are actually associated with the business that's inside, that's on site in the premises? Does that depart from the policy in any way?
Through you, Mayor Cole, in attending the site, I didn't see the ad brands being a tenant in that building. Now, I could be wrong, so separately and offline, I'll discuss that with the applicant just to confirm that. That aside, should the applicant be a tenant in that building, they would be it's acceptable to be advertising services and products offered from that business. Still would be uncertain as to whether displaying products from your client would satisfy that policy definition of billboard. Probably want to give that more consideration given this circumstance. But irrespective of whether it's third-party advertising or not, there are other provisions in the policy itself, and that is set out in the detailed assessment table where discretion is being sought. This is also an above-roof sign that is intended to be limited to a certain area. This exceeds that by a fair bit. So ultimately there's other departures being sought aside from the fact of the content of the sign.
Okay, and just my last question, page 124 in the applicant's submission, in the consultant's submission, is so this is looking at the impact on residents. The reference, so St Bart's House is identified, and it identifies 3 properties to the northeast that are low-rise housing with no view of the screen. Am I correct that the concrete batching plant that ceases to operate in 2025 is zoned, is it R160? Is that correct? An allowable building height of 8 stories? And if we can perhaps just, whether it's now or in the briefing notes, get some idea of what the city aspect view would be from any potential development there if it was built within the allowable built format, and potentially how that the view of the screen, where that would be. I understand the screen's only four stories high effectively, but just some idea of how that would impact upon any city view or aspect from development on that side.
Through Mayor Cole, that can be arranged, yes.
Councillors, Councillor Hallett, and then Councillor Loden.
Just in relation to the comments around the applicant being a tenant and the association of that with what's then displayed in the screen, what would be the status of the screen if they stop being a tenant?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if the proposal was supported, then my suggestion is that you would want to tie that to that particular use. Ultimately, if the tenant ceased operating from that site, then if there wasn't some sort of link to that use itself, then you would have this billboard that would be displaying third party, undoubtedly.
Councillors, Councillor Loden.
One of the suggestions put forward was that the main road safety concerns can be, or there's a potential to disregard them because the majority of billboards are located in areas which would not be approved, if I understood the comment correctly. Is that the city's understanding of that situation?
Through you, Mayor Cole, ultimately I would caution against dismissing or disregarding Main Road's comments. It's a due regard matter from a public authority. They've made clear comments around the appropriateness of the signage based on their policy guidelines for advertising within the road reserves and adjacent to. Albeit this is on private property, it's still within it is visible and it is prominent from the Grand Farmer Freeway heading westbound. Now, ultimately, there's a couple of key criteria that is considered by Main Roads in terms of the acceptability. It was referred to by the applicant. One of them is device restriction areas and the other being crash data. So device restriction areas really relates to the local environment of the road, because there's all sorts of different circumstances. So in the policy it sets out if there's an added lane or a merging lane, or if there's directional signs, that can present a conflict for the drivers and a distraction. Now, based on that assessment and based on the road conditions at this point, where you can view the sign, it cannot be supported from that perspective. That is very different to the City of Perth example that was referred to, because that has a merging lane, but that merge point is within the tunnel itself, so it doesn't happen before the entrance. So different circumstances in that scenario for City of Perth. It was considered a low risk from a crash data perspective, which is the second aspect. Crash data really represents the potential for safety issues to arise, and they basically look at crash data history. And this particular proposal in the road safety assessment that was put forward, and it's in the agenda, it sets out that it fails in all regards. It's over the crash acceptability rate. So I don't think that we should take that lightly from a safety perspective. Safety is absolutely critical. So from that regards, that's also an issue for Main Roads and for the city in its recommendation.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to that, or are you still asking about that issue? Right. Oh, I was just wondering, because I was going to ask the same question around some of the terminology referred to in the report, and the letter from Main Roads, which is included as an attachment, is quite brief. So I just thought it'd be helpful to get a little bit more understanding of Main Roads policy, because they refer to turbulent zone, extension zone, and then they also talked about critical crash thresholds. So if we could have a little bit more information around that terminology, that would be helpful.
Yes, Mayor Cole. Ultimately, that can be provided in the briefing notes, but that really does relate to the decision-making and level of distraction at any given point in time when you're about to enter, in this scenario, the Graham Farmer Freeway Tunnel. Yeah. That's all specifically defined in the policy, and that can be provided to you in briefing notes.
But are those concepts, I know that the crash threshold will be different depending on where it is, but the device restricted area is quite broad. So are those concepts more specific to the actual location of the billboard, or do they, I'm just sort of interested to know whether they apply across the whole device restricted area, or whether this is something which is more specific to this particular location?
Through you, Mayor Cole, device restricted areas apply to any circumstance where there's a signage within the road reserve or adjacent to. It just comes down to the specific circumstances relating to that. So this road environment is very different to any other. So you need to have regard for the on-ramp, the off-ramp, as well as the digital speed limit signs that's affixed to the tunnel. All three of those aspects contribute to this not being acceptable for Main Road. So I take on board your comment around, it's pretty confusing around conflict zone, extension zone, turbulent zone, but they basically all relate to, I guess, driver distraction at any given time on your approach to the sign. I can provide that in the briefing notes to you.
Thank you, Manager. Appreciate that. Sorry, back to you, Councillor Loden.
No problem. Also, there was a view expressed that the signage policy is a little bit out of date, as it is silent on issues such as digital signs. I wondered if the city had a comment on that.
Through you, Mayor Cole. The signage policy has overarching objectives to, I guess, maintain, traffic corridors and avoid the proliferation of signage ultimately, and it needs to be signage needs to relate to the business operating from that premises, and I guess that's fundamental to the signage policy. In terms of it being out of date, maybe from the perspective of the technology, it doesn't specify large format digital signage, which is quite common now, and that was flagged by the applicant, so that's accepted. But I guess the principle of the content of that sign does not change. Council and City of Vincent is very different to City of Perth, and that we've got a position on third-party advertising signage, and it's very clear in the policy. It's a prohibition, so Council could depart from that, but my suggestion is that you need to be clear in terms of what makes this particular circumstance different and why it should be supported in such a prominent location.
Councillor Fotakis.
Thank you, Mayor. It's just following on from an earlier question from Councillor Loden and the Mayor regarding some understanding on the billboard. Also, just some contrast, sort of understanding the billboard that's on Kwinana Freeway around Mount Street, the one that's mounted on Mount Street, where we've got all those multiple merging lanes coming in from West Perth, and understanding, and thanks for the explanation about really the assessment for main roads, but I also just want to contrast it to that application as well, because I know the applicant raised the Aberdeen Street one, but that for me is one of the glaringly obvious digital billboards that is around a very heavy part of the freeway.
Thank you. Taking questions rather than comments. That's a question. Okay. Do you have a response, Manager?
Through you, Mayor Cole, my response would be I'll take that on notice and provide some information.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, we've finished asking questions on this item, so we shall continue to move on. The next item raised by a member of the public gallery was item 7.6, City Property Management Framework Draft. Questions on this item? Councillor Fotakis.
It's just going back from a comment from the gallery with regards to their question on the consultation that was done with sporting clubs.
Through you, Mayor, there has been a great deal of consultation with community groups from 2016 onwards, as the gentleman indicated. More recently, in a lot of detail in August and September last year, while we were finalising the framework in its current form. And with some groups, we've had more recent discussions with them as well.
Thank you. Just to follow up to that, because I think the question was whether the framework where, the draft that has been presented to Council has been sent to community groups, and whether they have all been informed that it's on tonight's agenda and next Tuesday night's agenda.
I'll need to take that one on notice. Yep.
Councillors. Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. So, I think, paraphrasing from the comments from the gallery to ask as a question, there was some queries around whether the situation up until now has been fair or equitable, and whether the framework takes into account some of the disparity in level of city support and level of contribution from some of the clubs, but also take it as a straight request rather than, certainly not a threat, but a straight request that in the event the city is presenting this as the equitable way to move forward, what is the city's responsibility in terms of building standard, in terms of facility standards, and and some of those onerous tasks such as painting or some of those maintenance tasks when perhaps some of the buildings aren't in the best condition to start with. Is that something that I understand obviously it's being dealt with as part of our strategic process, but is that something that fits into the framework at all? Is that on a case-by-case basis? Or, I guess, asked as a straight question, is there an expectation now that because the city is saying we're now charging fairly for our facilities, that the facilities will be up to the standard that the community expect for the monies that they are paying?
Through yourself, Mayor, I think there's a couple of different answers to that. So the first thing is that the framework does propose some better clarity around responsibilities for repair and maintenance and capital upgrades. So that has been uncertain and a bit disparate up until this point. Definitely, we have a plan in terms of capital upgrades of properties. I think the tenancy, particularly for Category 1 and 2, is very generous in terms of its standards, and I think it is the point is well taken that some of these properties do need work to be done. We have been going through a process of updating a number of the properties. So what I would be suggesting is that as we are rolling out this framework, which will be done progressively over time, we're having conversations with the tenants about the prioritisation of any work that needs to be done.
Thank you. And just flagging that in the event that all of the groups in Category 1 and Category 2 haven't been informed that it's coming to next week's agenda, unless there is a burning reason why, can I just flag that I'll seek to defer the item so that they do have an opportunity to review it and come back. I understand there's been consultation along the way, but if they haven't been informed, I assume the earliest they'd be informed would be tomorrow or Thursday. But unless there's a reason why, I probably would seek to defer it until the next council meeting.
I'll take that one on notice, thank you.
Noted. Questions, council members? I do have quite a few, Director, so I'm happy for you to take them on notice if I rattle them off. Just in relation to the Category 3 definition, commercial entities and large clubs, associations and community organisations, it does further in the framework talk about the fact that this is really, statewide or national clubs, or, big clubs would have the capacity to pay. But I just thought the wording large perhaps in the definition didn't perhaps capture that, and it just really, I don't know, you may feel differently, but just for consideration. And in relation to the responsibilities for Category 1 groups, it talks about for licence and leaseholders that they would have responsibility for rubbish and recycling bins. So I just wanted to check whether our community groups are already receiving a service from the city's waste team without having to specifically pay for that waste service. And then when we talked about leasing to Category 1 small groups, it does talk about the fact that those groups would be responsible for capital upgrades. And I'm just interested to know that, given that they've noted to have limited or no capacity to generate revenue and restricted to low membership fees, how that might be possible, if that's realistic, whether it's just sort of small upgrades, or that, they could make a submission to the city. I'm not really sure how that would work. For example, I think with our play groups, the only way that they've had an upgrade is to actually come to us through budget submission time and seek funding. And similar for Category 2, it talks about responsibility for rubbish and recycling bins, so the same question. And again, for licence and leaseholders, they would be responsible for capital upgrades.
Mayor, if I could just respond to one of those points. Category 1, it does talk in the essential term template, responsibilities of the tenant and then responsibilities of the city. So if we look under the responsibility of the city, that's where there are capital upgrades and repair and maintenance. So for the smaller groups, the city takes more of a lead in that process, and then I suppose the burden shifts between the parties depending on the size of the organisation.
Okay, so that's scaled as opposed to just a one-size-fits-all across the
Correct.
categories. Okay, I note that. Thank you. Just when we get to the category 3s, it talks about initial term of 10 years with an option of 10 years. That is quite a significant move when looking at 20 years. So I'm just querying whether that's a move that we should be making, given that we have had some issues with long-term leasing arrangements, and our current policy talks about 5 plus 5. So flagging that one.
Just noting in the documentation it says up to 10 years, so I suppose that would be the outer limit, but your point is well taken.
Okay. And going to the detail at the back of the document, which is very useful, interesting when you're looking at GRV measure, so that you're still seeing variations in similar uses. So I've looked at playgroups, for example, from $361 to $1,500 per annum, and it's based on GRV. I understand that we've got to find the fair way of doing it. I'm just trying to understand the difference in GRV, for example, of Highgate Forest Playgroup versus the Mount Hawthorn Playgroup. Is it location-based? Because, I mean, they seem to be... I know we don't set GRV, but when you sort of look at the two centres, it's difficult to sort of see why the GRV would be so different, other than that one is in Highgate, which may be more expensive. Would that be the answer?
I'll just need to take that on notice.
Yep.
I have to have a look.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. And then just in relation to the tables at the back, I thought it would be really useful to have, where you've got the table that shows lease date, proposed tenancy fee, subsidy, annual payment to the city, it would be really useful to have 2 additional tables side by side showing current lease payment. I know that information is there, but when you're sort of going across with your eye, you'll be able to glean it all at one time, and then the percentage difference up or down for each community group. And I was also wondering that where there is what may be a significant change upwards for a small community like a Category 1, is there any consideration of some kind of transitional arrangement, given that they may need to generate more income and they may need to consider things like membership fees to compensate? Has that been considered at all, or would that be on a case-by-case basis?
The majority of Category 1 leases actually have more beneficial arrangements, but certainly I'm giving some thought to the implementation process, and I think we have some latitude there to work with community groups in terms of the actual process to transitioning to the new framework.
Thank you. And also I just had a query around Perth Soccer Club. I thought that they were actually paying a much higher lease fee than $1,883 per annum because of the recent... when we actually went through a SFF grant, there was significant capital support from the City of Vincent, and as a result I thought that their leasing fee was quite a lot higher.
Through you, Mayor Cole, are you referring to Perth Junior Soccer Club at Forest, I can't remember what the park's called, sorry, or are you...
It doesn't, it just says Perth Soccer Club. It doesn't stipulate.
Okay, because there's 2 references there. The junior one is lower, while Perth Soccer, for their lease at Dorrien Gardens, the fee I think is $15,000, and then we get 50% of the naming rights sponsorship. But we can confirm
it says Perth Soccer Club, $1,883.75 current lease fee.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that must be for the junior soccer club at Forest Park.
So just to clarify, how will we be treating the Perth Soccer Club, which is on quite a high leasing payment?
Through you, Mayor Cole, they'll be in Category 3, so we'd be, at the moment, their current lease would remain as is, and then if we were renegotiating, we'd look at the market rent for that site, and then council would make a decision on that. So it wouldn't be a percentage of the gross rental valuation. Okay, so that would be great if you could just make that clear. Thank you. And
And also, just in relation to the outcomes of consultation and feedback from groups, we don't really have a sense of how this has been received. It sort of hasn't really been. Has there been any documentation of feedback received from the community groups?
I'll need to take that one on notice. I have seen various components of the feedback, but I'll just see if I can consolidate that and include it in the briefing notes.
Thank you. And I think that just sort of based on the questions I've asked, I'll probably just flag an amendment in relation to the Category 3 term of lease, which allows currently that would allow up to 20 years. Any other questions? Okay. Next item raised was 8.2, which is minutes and motions from annual general meeting of electors held on the 28th of January 2020. Questions? Councillor Hallett.
Just one in relation to the motion regarding Colvin Lane that wasn't supported by administration, and it was clear that admin didn't support the motion's specific suggestions around traffic calming or addressing speeding in that space, but just wondering if admin had considered any alternative options or made any representations to West 1 regarding the concerns that were raised.
Through you, Michael, I'll take that question on notice.
Councillor Gonchevsky.
This is just a follow-on from Councillor Hallett. Just, if I've missed it, my apologies. If there was any assessment undertaken of traffic volume or speed, and whether the current measures are effective at maintaining safe speed within that space.
Through you, Michael, I'll take that question on notice as well.
Councillors, Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. The motion in relation to undergrounding of power specifically referred to not having the city funding it, and the response proposed by the city refers to the city's not being able to fund it. My understanding of the request was that it was to look at a funding model that didn't require the city to use its financial position, and the response is we're not in a financial position. The mover of the motion and the times that it has been brought up before is clearly of the view that that's not the question that was asked. Can we just get some commentary around why the city's financial position relates to the undergrounding of power when the model suggested was to make the burden on ratepayers over time in the same way that Subiaco has done?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we would still need to raise the rate revenue as part of the city's revenue collection in order to start putting together a reserve pool for that. So it's the city's money is, if the city has money, it is the ratepayers' money because we've rated them for it.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, if we went to I'll ask it another way. Has the work been done, or what? Can we get some inclusion in the briefing notes as to what work has been done? And it does date back to 2013 in relation to investigation of the potential costs. And there was money on budget, and it was in the CBP at one point to actually go out to consultation to the community in relation to the willingness or otherwise to have it funded through a special levy on rates, not necessarily directly through rates. So obviously rates is the city's money, the community's money is one and the same. But the question, as I understand it, was quite specific about a financial model where 100% of the cost impost would be charged via a levy on rates or otherwise. So if the rate increase in any given year was 2%, let's say, and it might be an additional 0.5%, 1%, 16%, whatever it may be, that's the information that I understood was being sought, and it hasn't been provided. There's no question, or the question wasn't, is the city in a financial position to fund it? So if we can get some detail around what work has been done, but in relation to the specific motion, and we can deal with some of the implications of it thereafter, please.
Through you, Merkel, yes, we can provide that additional background.
Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Gonchevsky.
Just in relation to the Mr. Myers' question about the submissions, I just had a question in terms of the city's community engagement platform. Is what what proportion of comments do we receive in relation to our consultations via that platform, and whether there would be some merit in expanding access to the comments received by via that platform to council members, so that should they choose to, they can review consultation responses in full without requiring them to be printed and or digitally reported.
Through you, Mayor Cole, can I just clarify? I think the motion was referring to non-planning items, so can I just clarify, is your question related to all the non-planning consultation?
I think my question was more around consultation on the platform, but I presume that we do undertake a number of our consultations through non-planning consultations through that platform as well, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong.
Yes, thanks through you, Mayor Cole. The city uses Bang the Table, EHQ software to conduct the vast majority of its community consultation, and the software provides lots of different options for producing reports, summary reports, full reports and the like, and we can provide that in different forms and show different examples to council members on what their preferred mode for receiving that reporting is.
I think my question was whether it was possible for council members to have access to the system to therefore negate the need for any reporting to be performed, which would be an administrative burden and wouldn't necessarily fulfil what the speaker was talking about, which is access to unrestricted and unedited comments that are received via consultation.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I can take that one on notice and confirm about administration rights and access rights and usability of that from the back end.
Any further questions on this item? Okay, moving on. That concludes items raised by members in the public gallery this evening, so we'll go back to the items that haven't yet been questioned and queried, and work through them sequentially. Just noting at this time, which is 20 to 9, we have 22 items left to go through. So the next item is 5.4, City of Vincent submission on commercial building approval reforms consultation regulatory impact statement. Any questions on this item? I believe there are none. Okay. So that takes us to item 5.6, Community Sporting and Recreation Facilities Fund Small Grants Application, Leaderville Tennis Club. Any questions? Councillor Loden.
Just a quick one. Why are we not submitting an application for funding? It seems that there might be an opportunity there.
Through you, Mayor Cole, sorry, can I just clarify, do you mean...
So there's a grant process which Leaderville is submitting into, which we normally coordinate, and there's a note in the report that says we are not proposing to submit an application ourselves this year.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I'll take that one on notice, but I do understand that we don't have specific projects that meet the requirements of that grant, but I will confirm that in the briefing notes.
But just to be clear, we're supporting Leaderville's application. Yep. Any questions? Okay. Moving on to 6.3, Waste Strategy Project 8, Commercial Waste Collections Options Appraisal. Questions? Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole. I have a question about a couple of the options that are proposed or that are suggested. In particular, option number 3 refers to providing limited charge services per residential customers. I just would like some clarity around what exactly that could look like. It says in the advantages that it may suit smaller non-food premises, small offices, but disadvantages are that standard domestic bin service is not designed for commercial customers. I assumed this to mean that we could have a mechanism to determine that some small businesses actually had very similar needs to a residential premises and could therefore still access the domestic service. So I'm just wondering if that is what you are proposing in that particular option. That's my first question.
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole, that is what's being proposed in that option.
So on that basis, if that was the criteria for determining suitability, would that then negate that first disadvantage, that by definition it would be suitable?
To some extent, through you, Nicole, that is the case, but there will still be occasions where, even though we could accommodate a business with a domestic service, it may still be better for them to get a commercial service from an environmental perspective. So if I give you a simple example, an office, there are companies that collect office papers, high quality, and there's a really good market. We could never offer that, so that might be a better option for that particular business.
But I mean, that would be no different to the current circumstances where those businesses can opt to take a commercial waste collection service if they choose. It's just that in this scenario, they would still have the option to access the city's waste collection services.
Yeah, through my colleague, in that circumstance, it would obviously, the city would need to assess whether that was appropriate. The current system is they obviously take a service, irrespective of whether that's appropriate or not, because that service is given through a policy, through an entitlement.
And if this option was to be explored, I know it's probably very difficult to put a number to it, but presumably there would be some cost savings to the city. It has $0 in that particular column, but if we envisage a situation where the bulk of the commercial waste operations were moved away from city operations, but some small businesses remained, there would still be some cost savings to the city in that scenario. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So in this scenario, the city would substantially remove itself from the commercial market, so not service the vast majority of businesses. It would, under this option, service a small number of appropriate premises, and obviously the option talks about it being charged, so it would be a cost recovery basis. So you're right, we would make the operational saving described throughout the report, and this would be no additional cost in that respect.
And in relation to options 4 and 5, would it be right to say that there's also an option 4A that is sort of a halfway point in those particular scenarios where there's a rebate of a portion of the savings?
Yes, through my call, we've from an infrastructure perspective, we've been careful to steer ourselves away from the issue of the rebate, which is essentially a budgetary decision. But Council has at its disposal a variety of options on the extent and the size of the rebate. So you're right, there's a range of rebates that could be offered.
And in relation to timing of these particular options, in the recommendation, point 2 is approves the business case to discontinue commercial waste from the 3rd of August. So I'm a little unclear what we're in a position to approve at this point. Is administration looking for a decision on one of those options and then in the same breath a timeline of the 3rd of August? Because there's not necessarily, well, that's a comment, but I guess it's a question, is that what you're looking for next week?
Through McCall, yeah, that's correct. So we are looking for a clear decision. The recommendation is that obviously we discontinue the service, which is either option 4 or 5, with a rebate to be dealt with as part of the budget process. The date of the 3rd of August is the latest date operationally that we believe we could end the commercial service, because we would need to remove the bins currently used for those commercial services before we introduce FOGO. So that is the latest date, allowing for 5 weeks to retrieve those bins.
And does that date also correspond with when you would need to proceed with future commercial waste collection contracts if we proceeded with one of the other options or the status quo?
Through my colleague, well, it would be a little bit of leeway of a matter of a few weeks, but we would begin the process of removing the commercial bins on the 3rd of August, and it would take us about 5 weeks.
Councillor Toppelberg.
Question to the CEO. The wording of recommendation 1.3, my understanding is if this council was to choose to proceed with the status quo and require administration to provide communication to support that, that would absolutely be the requirement of administration. It's not able to say to council that it won't prepare communications if that's what council decides to do. Am I correct?
So could you repeat the question?
My understanding of the Local Government Act is if we say that we want to proceed with the status quo and require administration to support that with communications, that administration is required to do that, not to say for noting that basically you can choose to do whatever you like, but if you choose the options we don't like, we won't support it with communications. That's my reading of recommendation 1.3. Am I correct?
No, through you, Mayor Cole, if council decides to maintain the status quo, there will be nothing to communicate.
Councillor Gonchevsky.
Just going back to our waste strategy, I note that in the waste strategy document for the commercial options appraisal, it doesn't actually contemplate the cessation of the service, but I appreciate that that has been one that has been considered. Just going on from Councillor Castle's comment, so the purpose of this report to council is that administration is seeking clarity in relation to what type of service will be offered to businesses post FOGO rollout to residential properties. Is that correct?
Through you, Nicole, and let's see if I can answer those questions. You're right, the waste strategy doesn't mention discontinuation of service. It just says a review will be carried out, and there was no particular option recommended in that report. The clarity I think that we are seeking, so the report presents the outcome of the project, which was to review the options, and obviously a recommendation has been made about how to continue. The link with FOGO is that clarity would be more than helpful before the beginning of the FOGO service for all the reasons listed in the report.
But essentially, administration requires clarity on how far FOGO, to what extent FOGO would be rolled out within the city so that it can effectively go out to a tender process in relation to the types of collections and tonnages that would be expected, and bins, etc., and lifts and so on.
Through you, Michael. No, the report and the previous Pori reports never intended for FOGO to be provided for commercial businesses. So that was never the intention. That was always going to be a domestic service. So I suppose the report seeks council's input into the future of commercial services, whatever that may be, provides a number of options and obviously recommends one of those.
Councillors, I have a number of questions. I'm just going back to the waste strategy and where it has been flagged to the commercial ratepayers that this might, have been something that was coming up so imminently, and I think the waste strategy hasn't given an inkling that there might be cessation of service, and I'm just really wondering about how we make such a significant change at the doorstep where with FOGO we've said we're having a rollout period of, I think it was more than 12 months, but with commercial waste payers we're being asked to make a decision of the 3rd of August. I guess I'm querying that and whether the administration thinks that that's a sufficient period of time to actually give notice and to hear about the impacts that might have on commercial rate payers. Because my question is, the report talks about the fact that it's impossible to calculate the financial impact for commercial rate payers. But I'm sure that as soon as we make an announcement, then commercial ratepayers will start reporting back to us what those impacts are. So should we be making a decision without understanding what the impacts are to commercial ratepayers?
So, McCall, I'm not sure I can give a clear answer to that question. I mean, the waste strategy in draft was widely publicised and consulted upon, albeit that it didn't specifically mention the end of or discontinuation of the commercial service. We've thought long and hard about the amount of time it would take for a business to organise an alternative service if the city were to discontinue. 5 months, in our opinion, is certainly sufficient. We've spoken to the waste industry body, and they have said that they know of at least 5 providers that would be very competitive in this market, and it is a competitive market, and there would be lots of competition. So they would have no concerns that businesses would be able to find a replacement service by the 3rd of August.
That's not my concern so much. It's more about the financial impact for commercial ratepayers and not having an understanding of what that might be. And I'm just wondering if there is any way that administration could help us to understand what those impacts might be, and whether that might be through the waste industry body, whether it's through understanding the bin lifts per precinct that we have and providing de-identified information to the waste industry body, whether it's talking to the City of Perth about how they run their commercial waste services. I just feel like they're, it's not, I understand the city can't go out and encourage commercial operators, but I think that there is potentially ways to try to understand scenarios for different scales of commercial operators. Is that something that there's any willingness to undertake by the administration?
So, McCall, I just don't think that's an easy task. I mean, the commercial operators will not give us commercial rates. Some of them undercut their competitors by 50%, so they will not share that information with us. They do it on a case-by-case basis. They visit the premises. The other thing that's difficult to compare is that currently from the city they may get an allocation of 4 bins, 2 recycling, 2 rubbish. A commercial service would offer something completely different. It could be cardboard only, glass only, food only, office paper only, so a completely different service with a cost structure that we are unable to see. So it's a very difficult task. I mean, what we can say, which is alluded to in the report, is that commercial businesses currently get, or at least a large percentage of them do, get a service included in their rates from the city. So depending on the rebate, they will probably lose financially because they will need to get a commercial service from somebody else because it will no longer be included in rates.
I guess that's the other thing, that the extent of the abatement in terms of how that could ameliorate the additional costs is really a huge question mark, because without having information about a scaled idea of what sort of costs implications might be for commercial ratepayers, how do we understand whether the abatement of even the full amount could negate that?
As I said, through your call, that is a difficult question to answer without being that individual commercial business and knowing what their service will be into the future. It's a very difficult question.
Well, look, the other question I had is about why this now seems to be tied to FOGO, because when the waste strategy was prepared, all of these projects were, the options appraisals were presented as discrete projects, and I understand with FOGO we'd be moving to a fortnightly collection of the waste bin, but it now seems that there's some urgency that we must make this decision by the 3rd of August, whereas I don't think that discussion had taken place previously. So the question is, can we continue to go through FOGO whilst looking at some other option for commercial, whether that be a transitional arrangement, whether we start to provide a base service and then start to charge for additional bins? Is administration's advice that this is now time imperative because of FOGO and that we must make this decision? And is it possible for the status quo to remain when we move to FOGO?
Through you, Nicole. Well, I think the recommendation would remain unchanged whether the city was doing FOGO or not. I think FOGO, to put it simply, just makes the situation worse. The disparity between a domestic service and the commercial requirements are widened by FOGO, but the introduction of FOGO per se is not the reason why administration is recommending that service is discontinued. I think the time imperative is the fact that we're about to go to contract. The services are currently merged, so there's one single service for commercial and domestic, and we're about to go out to contract. The set of contracts will be different to what they currently are because of the introduction in FOGO. So there's no doubt from an administration perspective that clear direction before we go out to contract would enable us to get the best service at the best price and have some clarity for the future. So that's the issue with time.
I very much understand and appreciate that from the city's perspective. I guess I'm trying to come from the perspective of the commercial ratepayer. I'm just wondering whether we really need to consider time to consult and get feedback from commercial ratepayers about this issue. It's interesting that there are no commercial ratepayers in the public gallery this evening. I think that it's something they would not be aware of. And I just wanted to know, in terms of the communications plan, is that something that could be provided to council members in the briefing notes? Because I think that's a key document. And it does talk about comms being developed from mid-March to June. So really interested to know what the administration's plans are in terms of comms, when engagement will start. And I just keep coming back to how can we have some understanding of the impact on commercial ratepayers. From the city's perspective, I understand it, but from the commercial ratepayers' perspective, there's question marks. And I'm just looking for advice on how we might get a better idea around that.
Through Nicole, the comms plan, that's absolutely no problem. It's already in draft. The intention is, as soon as a decision is made, we'd give businesses the maximum notice of any change, and the approach is to be very supportive to assist them in finding a new service. As I said, we've contacted the industry body and also WALGA, so we can provide a list of preferred suppliers through WALGA with contacts and industry representatives as well. So the idea is to be very supportive, give people advice, and transition them over to a new service. So that's absolutely no problem. I know we keep coming back to trying to calculate the impact on individual businesses. As I said, it's going to be very difficult to look at that from an individual basis. I think realistically, which is referred to in the report, costs for that business will go up because currently they get what is essentially a subsidised service, not tailored to their needs, capacity allowance not based on what they pay, and so undoubtedly the majority, I would say, will pay more. Now, how much more, I just couldn't tell you until that transition happens. So that is a very difficult question to answer. I really wish I could, and I apologise that I can't give better information than that.
I guess I'm not asking for information on every commercial ratepayer in the City of Vincent. I'm just wondering if we could get some kind of scaled information about if you're a business of this size with this floor space and your bin requirements are X. This, if we gave scenarios of different commercial ratepayers within the City of Vincent, and we went to City of Perth, who provides a commercial ratepayer service, or to the waste industry body and said, this is just information seeking, does that present governance issues? I feel like I don't understand why getting some scenarios is something that is too difficult or presents governance issues. I'm happy to hear why that is, but I can't understand why that's not possible.
Through Michael, so we would need to have somebody that had the professional knowledge of commercial services to visit individual premises, look at what they currently receive from us, decide based on a basket of services that the commercial sector would provide what would be the best option for them. So imagine, as I said, we provide 4 bins. Somebody would need to say, well, we wouldn't provide 4 bins in that configuration. We would do something completely different, larger bins, smaller bins, different bins, etc. On this frequency. So we need somebody to be able to do that. That's the first thing. The second thing then, we'd need to know what those rates are, those commercial rates, which, as I said, the commercial operators won't provide for us. So there's 2 aspects to be able to do that piece of work, and we just don't have that knowledge within the city because we don't provide proper commercial services. The City of Perth publishes its rates, so they're not difficult to see. They provide a proper commercial services because they service, I think, 60% of their ratepayers are commercial, so they're in a completely different scenario to us, so they do. So I could look at what a general waste bin cost if you have the City of Perth of a certain size. What I couldn't tell you is how that relates to the other bins that they would have and the frequency of that collection based on what the City of Perth do have people that, specifically do that. So I know I'm appearing evasive, but it's just a very difficult exercise and, for us to achieve, really.
Well, then the other consideration is whether we take the opportunity to first consult with commercial ratepayers so that they can tell us what their needs and the implications would potentially be. But I just, I guess this issue of the time imperative is now at play. And it just really brings me back to the question of if we wanted extra time to consult or to hold workshops with commercial ratepayers and talk to them about these scenarios, will this in any way impact on our ability to move forward with FOGO?
Through you, Nicole, it would be a difficult thing to do because we need clarity to be able to go to contract, which is scheduled for April, so that would be difficult to do that. We could exclude commercial from those contracts and put it out and see what happened and try and approach something later in the day. But as I said, the best way is to have a clear decision right now to allow us to write that specification and go to tender. I think if we consult with businesses, probably the majority would, hope that the council would carry on because they're used to that service. I think the administration would still advise that's not the best environmental option, doesn't meet the, the vision and the aims in the waste strategy. So even if businesses did say they would like the city to carry on, if they said we'd like the city to carry on but we have to pay, we would still, you can see that's one of the options in the paper, and we still recommend that that's not the best option for us because it would require a big investment, and so even if they wanted us to carry on but we're prepared to pay, we would still say that's not the best option, and that's outlined in the options appraisal as well.
So just in relation to proceeding with the FOGO tender, but status quo for commercial, which has been presented to council as option 1, how would we continue to operate a waste service for commercial only if we don't understand what the commercial needs of our ratepayers are? And would that, you're talking about tender, but I'm assuming that if we did need to continue the commercial operators service, that would be done in-house by the city's waste team rather than a specific commercial tender. Is that correct?
Michael, we collect one bin ourselves, so we currently only partly service those commercial premises. The recycling bin is done by Cleanaway at the moment. So
well, that's fine, because with FOGO, my understanding is there's no change to recycling pickup, but the change is to the municipal waste bin. Yes?
Yes, we might call, but because waste would switch to fortnightly, that would be a service that we would anticipate will be provided by a private supplier, because we would continue the in-house with a weekly collection, because that's what we are resourced, and we have the equipment to carry the weekly collection. So what we'd anticipate is after the contracts, and there's a series of contracts because there's for processing as well, that we would collect the FOGO bin in-house. So the rubbish bin, fortnightly collection, would be somebody else, and the recycling bin would be somebody else. So essentially the commercial service would be serviced by somebody else on our behalf. The difficulty comes is that it's the frequency as well, because the rubbish bin will switch to fortnightly, and suddenly that disparity between commercial businesses gets bigger for obvious reasons.
Thank you, Director. Councillor Smith, did you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to continue your train of thought. I would like to throw in a red herring here, because I'm feeling like the commercial side of waste has been has been hasn't really been thought out very well. Is this an opportunity where we can stop and have a think about it? It sounds like we need more time to consider our commercial businesses and give them time to come up with their own strategies. And generally, when you are given more time, when you know that you've got a change, and this is a large change for a business, that they have to, it's something else that they have to think about. If they have more time to process it, we might find that they will answer their own questions anyway. But is this a time where we need to maybe consider holding FOGO for the time being, giving more time to the commercial, so we're not going out for tender, giving more time to the businesses, basically just changing our timeline and rethinking the strategy and coming up with something that's not rushed, and then also gives us the due process and the respect that our commercial businesses should have, and that we've engaged them properly, and just help them with this new change that they would be dealing with. Is this an option that we could even consider?
So, question on timing and further consultation. And delaying FOGO.
Okay, Michael. Through you, the current contracts come to an end on the 15th of September. So beyond that, we need a new contract for collection. So if we carry on as we are, 2 bins, 1 recycling, 1 rubbish we do ourselves, 1 is external, we'd have to go out to contract, and there's no option to extend. We did a contract deliberately to coincide with the introduction of FOGO. So in some form or other, we'd have to go back to market. So council can delay FOGO. That's not a decision for me. They, could delay that, and we could contract out a recycling service and continue as we are. The other option would be that I'm thinking on my feet now, which is that we continue with the FOGO introduction, but we separate commercial collection as being completely different, and we do a contract for commercial collection, both rubbish and recycling. The danger with that option, I think, is that costs are likely to rise, because that's a separate contract that we currently don't have. So if we continue as we are, we're trying to accommodate and introduce FOGO. We're trying to accommodate a commercial service that doesn't really work with a domestic. That is one option. And the other option is to have a completely separate commercial service, which I think costs would rise, because that's not a contract we currently have.
Councillor Konchevsky.
Following on from your comments there, Executive Director, given that we're in the process of going to tender, I'm wondering on what the possibility is, or whether it's been considered in relation to putting a tender out that includes a number of options or bolt-ons to the central service that would be able to be taken up by the city at the city's discretion, that would essentially allow the market to be tested for the actual costs of outsourcing a commercial service based largely on the status quo of general waste recycling, or perhaps a differential level of service rather than this sort of bespoke system that the city has implemented over time, but go out for a standard level of service that would be applied across all businesses in the same way that residents get the standard level of service and then are charged additional fees for extra bins. Whether that's able to be accommodated within the current planning for the tender. And then part 2 is just that I was unaware, and I'm sorry if this was something I should have known, that it was intended that the city would continue to run the FOGO collection and that the other elements would be the parts that would be outsourced. Just in relation to value for money, how it's been determined that that is the best value for money for the city, rather than, the city continuing to collect general waste or the city getting out of any waste. I guess, are we allowed to have offer a waste service but have that privatised? Is there any requirement that those services are offered by city staff, and is that something that's been considered through the tender process as to how we work out which particular elements of the waste service for residential properties we offer ourselves and which elements are outsourced?
Through you, McCall, I think the first part of the question is essentially the answer is that we could give as an option to contractors to provide a commercial service for us. So we would look at the service as is, the commercial, and ask the contractor to price separately for providing that service. That is possible. Uncertainty, the rule is uncertainty in a specification obviously increases cost, and that would be a concern. We may not have prices returned. Some people may not be interested in option, but we could certainly try that. So we would tender the FOGO service domestic and a separate option to do commercial. So that is possible. The problem we would face is that the time would start quickly running away. And before we know it, be on the 15th of September, we'd be needing to make decisions on contracts. So you'd be faced with the decision, in a matter of a few months, I guess, about whether you continue with commercial. And bearing in mind that the current contract ends on the 15th of September, then probably the notice period you could give to businesses would be a lot shorter than, if you made a decision next week. So that would be the only concern I'd have from an operational perspective. We've allowed 5 months notice for businesses, so that will be cut a lot shorter if you didn't continue. The second question about the suite of services that we provide and the private sector, absolutely what you say is true, and I think the best thing for me to do is to take that question on notice and provide separate information.
Councillor Fotakis and then Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Just going back on a couple of things that I want to get clear, and that's on the consultation that's been done so far, and not just with those ratepayers that are using our service, the 371 businesses that don't use our service, and maybe a bit of understanding as to what services that they're using. I think there's some useful information there for our businesses that are already in that space, and I suppose that touches on the Mayor's question on really getting an understanding and having some data on the costs. So what consultation's been done so far with the businesses?
Through McCall, there's been no specific consultation with businesses.
Okay, thank you, Director. And through you, Mayor, just on that note that you mentioned, there's up to 5 providers that could quote on these services. I'm looking forward through to the collections being done. Has there been any sort of traffic management assessment if we've got multiple providers coming into our town centres and coming into our business centres?
Through McCall, no, but the simple answer is that those bins or range of bins are already collected. They just be collected by somebody different. It could be at different times, could be at weekends, could be at night, etc. So it depends on the specific business.
Through you, Mayor, is this something that we need to actually have an awareness and a plan of logistically?
Through McCall, I don't think so. Those operators are already out there, already collecting bins. They're collecting from the 377 that don't use us. Many of the services, the commercial businesses that use us, take our allocation and then get top-up services from other people because our allocation is insufficient. So those operators are already in the area. You'll see their trucks around every day, which I notice because I'm a bit sad like that.
Thank you, Director. And just to get some understanding, whether there been consideration to have any form of sort of transition period where businesses may have been able to have an opt-in or an opt-out. I'm know that it's a little bit unwieldy, but was consideration given to that?
Through McCall, essentially the transition period is the 5 months that we're proposing, where we would inform businesses of any change, and then we would assist and support them to make that change, with the final date being that date in August. So that's the intention.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just a question about the contracts and the tenders that will need to be sought in for September. What's the standard term that you'd be looking for in those contracts?
So, Mayor Cole, the standard term is initial 5 years with an add-on option. Some councils do an additional 5 years as an option. We will be suggesting an additional 2 years, a 5+2 contract. Typically, the service provider that gets a contract for local government like us will purchase trucks at the beginning of the contract, and they write that capital investment down over 5 years. If you give a couple of extra years, they can manage that with the existing vehicle. So that's the market respond best to a 5-year initial term at least.
So would you have a sense of what a minimum term might be? I'm thinking if council was to choose status quo, which effectively might just mean deferring this decision, what would be the minimum? And we had to engage in a contract for the commercial waste collections. What would be the minimum term we'd be looking at?
Through my call, well, the minimum term could be anything, I guess.
That you would realistically get a tender for.
That is a difficult thing. I mean, we are a relatively small local government. You can see the number of commercial premises are actually quite small. So if you're talking about a separate collection for just commercial, then potentially 1 or 2 years is not impossible. I mean, we'd need to speak to the market about who would be interested in that, but that isn't impossible. I think what a commercial provider would probably do is they would use their existing commercial trucks and just charge us for those commercial trucks to visit our commercial businesses, which is not what they do currently. So, we'd pay by the visit and by the lift.
I guess what I'd be interested to see, if it was possible in the briefing notes, is if there would be a mechanism for us to defer a decision or to maintain the status quo for 6 to 12 months, given that the contracts are coming up for tender, and if there's any way that could actually happen, or if the advice is that we would not receive any tenders, that would, whatever that might be.
So, McCall, I certainly consider it and put it in the briefing notes. I think with the domestic collection, we do need to move on because we have this date of the 15th of September. So my recommendation would still be a 5-year minimum term, but we could separate off commercial collection and do that separately. My only concern is the cost would rise. And bearing in mind the cost of landfill and the cost of recycling is going up as well, that is a concern.
Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. The few questions. The bin audit that's proposed, the city undertook commercial bin audit a couple of years ago, which was physical, I'm assuming paid people on the ground going to each business and counting and putting stickers on there. Is that data considered to be potentially inaccurate? Because we've got the March to May proposal for the bin audit. Is that just augmenting the existing data, or is that starting again?
Through McCall, we're not proposing another bin audit. You're right, we did that bin audit some time ago. The minute you do a bin audit, it's inaccurate, but this is the best that we can work on. So the estimate of a 5-week retrieval time for the existing bins is based on that audit. So we're not proposing another audit.
In the key tasks, it says mid-March 2020 to mid-May 2020 to do a bin audit to confirm the bins, commercial properties and mixed-use properties. If that disappears from the time, is that an irrelevance if that just gets deleted from the timeline then? Through
my call, I might need to take that on notice. That's not my understanding, and I'll just need to refer the wording. That might be an error.
Now, you talked a few times about 5 months, but given we're being asked to make a decision on the 17th of March, even if it was communicated the next morning, that's still only 4.5 months between. So we're likely. Is it fair to say that, given the communication strategy won't have been shared with council, that would probably be somewhere more in the 3 to 4 month range by the time we actually get communications out to business, if August 3 is agreed to be the date of ceasing.
Through my call, I'll probably need to just count the weeks, but I'll check that. But certainly we have the comms plan drafted, and we would hope to inform businesses as soon as we had a decision to give them maximum amount of time. That's our intention.
Okay, and I just had a quick look at the City of Perth's services, and the City of Perth services are all GST exempt. Can we assume then that a service that's provided not from a local authority would automatically be 10% behind that would be potentially provided by the local authority, because the commercial service obviously has to charge GST?
Through my call, my experience is the commercial sector is a lot more competitive. My previous role at the City of Stirling, we ran a commercial service, and we were constantly being undercut by operators, so I don't think the GST makes any difference. Commercial operators are cutthroat. They also have a tendency to look at local government published rates and go straight in as soon as they're published and undercut. So if you ask me from experience, the commercial sector will be cheaper than the local government providing it.
Councillors. Councillor Loden.
If we proceed with, or we will need to proceed with recycling for the residential houses, do we have the ability to bulk for, which hypothetically would be for a 5-year period? Could we include provisions within that contract to provide 1 or 2 years worth of recycling collection for our commercial properties? And there's some opt-out for us that if we then in the future make a decision to no longer provide that service, that we could then discontinue it. And there's the certainty of the residential component for 5 years, and then a sort of option to you will be delivering the commercial part for a component, but maybe not the full duration.
Through you, McCall, we'd have to think about that. That sounds a little bit complicated. That may not work. And bearing in mind, we currently in-house provide a weekly service. The rubbish will become a fortnightly service. So the easiest fit without changing anything is for us to continue doing the weekly service. So it's not quite as simple as it seems. I think what we would be better doing is providing a separate proportion on the contract for commercial to be collected for a fixed period with some options.
Councillors, any further questions on the waste? Any further questions? Okay. Thank you, Director. Moving to 7.1, Investment Report as at 31st of January 2020. Any questions? 7.2, Mid-Year Review. Mid-Year Review, 7.2. Any questions on Mid-Year Review? I did have a quick question, and I'm happy for all of my questions to be taken on notice herewith. It was really about the fact that the capital expenditure being down $1.2 million, of which $373,000 was the public open space allocation for this financial year, and the recommendation being that goes back into general. Is this not an opportunity to preserve that and to start our public open space strategy reserve?
Thank you, Mayor Cole. I'll take that on notice.
Perfect. Any other questions on mid-year review? No? Okay. 7.3, financial statements as at the 31st of January 2020. 7.4, authorisation of expenditure for January 2020. Councillor Hallett.
Happy for this to be on notice. There's just an expense about staff training, sexual harassment workshop, and just wondering if that's part of a broader strategy or something prompted that.
Yeah, once again, I'll take that on notice. Thanks.
Councillors, I have a couple of very quick ones on notice. I note that we are paying the Chamber of Commerce and Industry an annual membership renewal of $11,300. Just interested to know when the city became a member of the CCI and what benefits we garner from the membership. And also very interested to hear more about the Forward Bound Gallery program, which sounds very interesting. That's also mentioned there. Any other questions? No. We do have 7.5 major public artwork, but because there are confidential attachments, I'll save that to the end and we can come back to that one so that we can go behind closed doors if we need to. 8.1, consideration of submissions on proposal to lease Beatty Park Cafe. Any questions on this item? No, okay. 8.2, minutes and motions from annual... Oh, sorry, we've dealt with 8.2, apologies. 8.3, licence of road reserve adjacent to 47 on plan 1962, which is number 29 Scarborough Beach Road, North Perth, Chinta Cafe. Any questions? I have a very quick question to be taken on notice. It does talk in the report that this is the existing alfresco area, so I just wanted clarification. Would this actually result in an increase in patrons using the area, or would it effectively be the same just with permanent umbrella structures?
Through you, Mayor Cole, there would be no change in the number of patrons, so it's basically just creating permanent umbrellas. The seating area will be the same size, and the number... So the planning approval with the number of patrons doesn't change.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions on this one? No? Okay. 8.4, advertising of development on city-owned and managed land property. Any questions on this item? Again, very quickly, I just don't know why we would need to have a process for approval of freestanding objects such as... and I thought that could be covered by our existing alfresco permits, and it does have a process which does, introduce some bureaucracy, which is part of what we do, but we always have to remain in check about if it's the right amount or too much. And one of the questions was whether the process would lead to lengthy timeframes, if we could get a prediction on how long it would take to move through those processes, and do we really need to formalise approval of our community groups putting banners in our parks? Does it have to be a formal process? And can we just get some advice from administration on whether 1.5 does actually provide for a clear pedestrian zone as opposed to 2 metres? So please take those on notice and we'll keep moving. CB, next item. Also, you have a question, CBP. Okay, so next item is the annual corporate business plan quarterly update, which is 8.5. Councillor Toppelberg.
Just super quick, can we get a higher resolution version, because it's hard to read because it's the scanned version? So if we can get a higher res version and made in the public agenda, that would be great.
CBP update. Just a request whether we might need to consider an amber as opposed to just a green and an exclamation mark for items that have started but are not likely to meet the time frame. For example, art strategy, community engagement charter, Woodville Reserve master plan, etc. Feel free to consider. Any other questions on the corporate business plan? Okay. The next item is 8.6, reimbursing the external members of the City's Audit Committee. Questions on this item? We have Councillor Gonchevsky and Councillor Toppelberg.
Or any other methods of remuneration considered, and like actually remunerating rather than paying?
Through Mayor Cole, could just clarify any other methods other than financial?
So, for example, having a member be able to provide evidence of their hourly rate that they are charged or that they charge, and therefore be able to claim on the basis of the actual expense that they may have incurred in terms of missing work to prepare, etc.
Through you, Mayor Cole, no, we didn't contact the external independent members to ask about how much they were paying and what actual loss. We looked at what other local governments paid and looked at what was an appropriate figure based on that, and also in comparison with what we pay our external design review panel members. But we can go back and get some approximations.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I was more whether there'd been an alternate model considered as part of the preparation of the recommendation, not whether that data had been obtained. Thank you.
Councillors? Councillor Smith?
Through you, Mayor Cole, just a query about how this actually became an item, considering that when the applicants would have applied, thank you, it was a volunteer role. So I'm just wondering why now we're talking about remunerating them. Thank you.
Through you, Mayor Cole, this was my suggestion based on appropriate compensation for the time foregone for professional members, given the fact that they will be essentially foregoing what could be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 billable hours in their private practice.
Councillors? I have a query on terminology. I was really surprised to see this expressed as reimbursing external members and that this is for an expense already incurred. Would this pass the taxation officer's definition of a reimbursement? And if it is a reimbursement for expenses already incurred, would the audit committee members therefore need to demonstrate a loss of income or foregoing of income to be reimbursed for? That's my question. And also, has this impacted on the city's ability to have candidates put their names forward? And do other local governments listed in the report also use a reimbursement expense repayment of expenses already incurred model?
I'll get the manager to comment on a couple of those questions. I think probably an important consideration in terms of a change, and we are moving to being directly audited by the Office of the Auditor General. It is now state government best practice, which hasn't been applied in local government up until very recently. The best practice is that there is an external independent chair of the audit committee. But as far as I'm aware, the City of Vincent is the only local government in Western Australia that has an external independent chair of the audit committee. So it is something which we're leading in and reflecting best practice, which will soon become mandatory, I would have thought, in most public sector agencies. And I'll ask the manager to explain why we've used that concept of reimbursement according to current regulations.
Through you, Mayor Cole, so the Local Government Act doesn't allow us to pay our external audit committee members, as you're aware. The Department of Local Government's provided advice to say you can reimburse them, and that's the approach that some other local governments have taken. Some local governments take the approach that they can't reimburse them for their loss of time, so it ranges, but the Department of Local Government has given us clear advice that says we can reimburse as long as it aligns with their expertise and knowledge that they bring to the committee and based on their time. So that's the approach that we've taken, and that a number of the other local governments, or the local governments that we've referred to in the report, that's the approach they have taken.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? I'm not absolutely clear. I'd have to go back and refresh my memory of the application, but is one of our members retired, and would an audit committee member actually have to show or demonstrate loss of income to be reimbursed? I'm just thinking of reimbursement in terms of taxation office and what's required in terms of reimbursement of expenses. Just generally, is that normally something is paid out or foregone and there's a demonstration of that to be reimbursed? And if, for example, an audit committee member is not losing income because they're attending in their lunch break, or they're not losing salary, how do they demonstrate that there is a reimbursement for an expense already incurred?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the other local governments that do pay their external audit committee members, I don't believe they ask the members to show like their loss of time. So there's a set fee. So, for example, I think Rockingham, they might pay them $1,000 per meeting, so it's just a fixed fee. So they're not actually asking people to show their loss of time and what that actually amounts to. But I can understand your point on the reimbursement, and that's why some local governments don't actually reimburse their members because of that.
Is this something that we actually need advice on? Because, terminology is really important, and I'd want to make sure that if council was making a decision around reimbursing audit committee members for expenses already incurred, that we were technically doing the right thing and that we were not simply providing a fee which is not permitted under the Act by creating new terminology that's not actually reflective potentially of... Sorry? I'm genuinely concerned about doing something that doesn't that would not actually pass the ATO test or the terminology test, and I'm seeking that additional advice.
Through you, Mayor Cole, so we have got advice from the Department of Local Government, but we can get external legal advice on how you interpret Section 5.100 of the Local Government Act, if you'd like.
I think at the very least I'd like to see the written advice from the department and then potentially further advice. Is there any other questions? Councillor Castle?
Just as a follow-on to that, if we are seeking any advice on this, that we bear in mind if the basis on which we assume we are reimbursing our members is loss of income, that if there is an assumption there that there is an income to be lost, does that impact our ability to further attract future members who may not fit within that category? So if we're setting this system up based on the current members that we have and their circumstances, that may not always be the case, and just that we're quite clear that this is not that it doesn't fall over if those new members in future years have different circumstances.
Can I just ask a question for clarity? My understanding of the advice, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's not specifically for the loss of income because the person is giving up that income. It is for their expertise and knowledge relating to their line of work, and that if they were self-employed professional, that's what their hourly rate would otherwise be. The tax impost is, or the tax implication is for the individual as to whether that is declared as income or otherwise. That's a tax question for the person who receives it. But the ability to pay it under the Act is because you are reimbursing for their expertise on the basis of which they would otherwise be able to entitle, and the individual tax circumstance, my understanding, is the circumstance for the individual. So can I just clarify if that's correct, firstly?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that is correct.
Just to follow up, I thought that you would be remunerated for your expertise as opposed to reimbursed, and that's why I'm seeking clarification.
Question as well. Have any of our existing external members been asked whether they believe they should be remunerated, would like to be remunerated, whether they would like it to be reimbursement? Have we had any discussion with our external members other than informing them that the matter may come to council?
Through you, Mayor Cole, no.
Any further questions on this item? Okay, we shall move on. The next item is the shared licence of community building at Woodville Reserve, 10 Farmer Street, North Perth, Transition Town Vincent and Ethnic Community Council of WA, Inc. Any questions? Councillor Loden?
Have we done any assessment of the two groups' ability to pay the fee?
Through you, Mayor Cole, they've both confirmed that they are able to pay the fee, and they've completed the health check, which includes details of their membership, financial, like previous year's financial statements. So we believe they are able to pay the fees.
And have we done any consideration of the benefits these organisations, obviously they work in different fields, provide to our community, and on that basis the potential for discounts to the fees that they pay?
Through you, Mayor Cole, are you referring to the rebate under the new property management framework? No, not yet. I think that would be done once the framework is adopted, but we can have a look at that. I can talk to the community partnerships team and provide an estimation.
So that would be retrospectively applied in this context?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if the property management framework's adopted, yes, then we'd apply that.
Councillors, any other questions? I just wanted to flag Clause 1 notes that the current condition of the community building adjacent to the tennis rooms, club rooms, etc., and it's asking Council to approve in principle the demolition or repurposing of the premises in 2020, 2021, 2022. Would that not be informed by the development of the Woodville Reserve Master Plan, and why would it be necessary for Council to commit in principle to that at this point when we are about to embark on that master plan?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we're trying to make it very clear to the lessees that there'll be no guarantee that they will be accommodated at the site following the outcomes of the Woodville Reserve Master Plan. So, and due to the building condition, the advice is that it won't be suitable to remain on the site in the long term. It would need substantial work. So we're trying to make it very clear to the lessees.
Okay, I do accept that, but I would probably just flag an amendment that might just have language that would be more around noting that the building is in poor condition, and that consideration of the demolition or repurposing will be, or that will be considered as part of the upcoming Woodville Reserve Master Plan, rather than us actually making an in-principle decision. That will be an amendment that I will just flag. Councillor Gondaszewski?
Just to make sure that we've got the information we might need if we wanted to make an amendment to the lease fee. Can I just confirm that we're going to receive an assessment of what the lease fee would be if the property management framework was adopted after, with, I guess, advice from community partnerships of what discount to that lease fee may be applied? So we would have a number that we could potentially, if we chose to, and if the property management framework was adopted, we could put in as an amendment to 2.3?
Yes, I can provide those details in the briefing notes, but then we should probably actually change that clause of the recommendation to reflect the lesser rent. So potentially it could be up to 50% reduced. So I'll discuss and we'll change, either put details in the briefing notes or just change the lease fee.
Just following up on that, would that require changes to the conditions if it was a fee in accordance with the framework? Would the conditions reflect what is proposed in the framework?
Through you, Mayor Cole, do you mean instead of listing all the conditions, we just say these conditions are consistent with the draft property management framework?
Either that, or would they be consistent with the draft property management framework? Because if they're getting the reduction in the fee, but but potentially the conditions are not as onerous, for want of a better word, I guess I'm just saying that the framework has been set up not just to be about a fee, but about obligations. So if we're going to change the fee, then would the obligations be the same?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the conditions proposed in this report are all consistent with those in the draft property management framework. We have included a few more express provisions relating to maintenance that relate to the current condition of the building. For example, we've put in that the building's leased as is, just because it is in the poor condition. So if during the term they're looking for us to undertake some work due to fair wear and tear, we're saying that it's leased as is and we wouldn't be undertaking any of those works. But otherwise it is all consistent, except for the rebate. We haven't noted that, so I'll check and clarify in the briefing notes.
Any further questions? Okay, thanks. Thank you, Manager. The next item is the lease of 4 View Street, North Perth to Pride WA Incorporated. Are there any questions? And then moving on to 8.9, amendments to the City's risk management policy and approval of risk appetite and tolerance statements. Any questions? Moving to 8.10, recording of public question time and deputations, amendments to the City's policy 4.2.4, council meetings, recording and web streaming. Any questions? Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. The proposed provision to effectively allow somebody who doesn't want to be recorded to ask for that relies solely on the discretion of the presiding member, the way that it's currently written, which at times may, depending upon, in a nice world, that's fair. But if council would council need to amend the policy such that that was an option that was available to any individual that didn't want to do it expressly? Because I can think of numerous occasions where the presiding member may not wish to grant that because they don't necessarily want to hear what that particular person has to say. Not in the current circumstance that we have in the chamber, but I can think of numerous circumstances previously, and that if we believe that it is a right of somebody to be able to express their view to council and not to be recorded, is that something that needs to be expressly mentioned in the policy?
Through you, Mayor Cole, in terms of the risk or likelihood of that occurring, we don't think it's necessary to be included in the policy.
It could be something to consider at the next review of the meeting procedures, because really the meeting procedures standing orders really are the critical local law, so that's probably a good place to consider that too. Any further questions? I did want to ask, just in terms of recommendation, it talks about approving the repeal of the city's policy and then approving the updated policy, but whilst I didn't hold the two together or, over a window with sun streaming through, I thought that they were just minor amendments rather than needing to repeal and replace. And the title of the item is amendments. So is it necessary to repeal or is it more of an amendment? Happy for you to take that on notice.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just quickly, we have changed the format, substantive content and the layout of the policy in a way that I think if we went through and track and showed the amendments, basically it is a new policy. That's why we propose to repeal and then we have council approve a new policy. But it is, the reason we called it amendment, I guess, is that it's trying to achieve the same thing as the previous. So I can review and will provide further details in the briefing notes.
Yeah, I guess if it's formatting, that's one thing, but if it's substance, that's another. Councillor Castle?
I have a quick minor technical question. In the report it says that to mitigate risk of offensive statements, we can immediately pause the web streaming. Has administration looked into any options for remote operation of the system? Because it strikes me that it would be very hard for someone to jump up and pause it very quickly if someone is on the brink of saying something offensive.
Through you, Mayor Cole, you haven't seen how quick the manager can run. Might have just finished a half marathon in Busselton or something. Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, we're in constant contact with the provider to try to improve how the system works, and this propositional requirement would involve an additional video camera to be able to capture the current lectern format. But I'd be very keen to hear any other comments from elected members about the room setup and format and how that could be optimised.
Councillors, any further questions? Okay. Next item is elected members' continuing professional development policy. This will be an absolute majority decision at the meeting. Any questions? Councillor Loden.
Just a query about consideration of feedback for council members to help inform their professional development. Was that considered as part of the policy at any point?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I had discussed this with Councillor Loden, and something which I'm very happy to consider. My view is it doesn't need to be included in this policy for it to occur, and for it to occur through agreement by council as a whole or through a personal approach from individual elected members. And the other comment I made to Councillor Loden is that we're also working on a governance framework which could incorporate some of the suggestions you've raised.
So something like that would be better to incorporate in the governance framework than here?
Through you, Mayor Cole, subject to Council's view on the content of the governance framework, that could be considered.
I guess so hypothetically I might think that I'm a very attractive, funny person and that I'm very easy to get along with, and the view of others might be that I'm not quite as attractive as I might think, and very difficult to get along with. Yes, it is. I would need potentially professional development to improve my working relationship with my peers and my colleagues, but unless I'm aware of that, I'm not going to know to do that. So that's how would we incorporate something like that, I guess.
Through you, Mayor Cole, one of the specific additions or enhancements or changes following the reforms to the Local Government Act last year was for this policy to make specific consideration for council development as a whole. Traditionally, it's been seen just to help facilitate individual council members going to individual training courses or conference and to cover that area. What this policy now encourages and will help facilitate is a council as a whole consideration of how council can develop as a single decision-making body, and that would require communication and discussion and a free exchange of views on how council works together as a single decision-making body. And my view would be that it would be impossible to have without that free and frank discussion and feedback between councillors and between council's administration, where we have a role in providing advice and information and support to council.
Final question. Is there anything that would preclude us from including a provision in here around that, around feedback for elected members if they wanted to take it up?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I can't see why it couldn't. That'd be up to council to consider. A comment from through you, Mayor Cole. There could be some indication of that general concept, but how that was formalised would need to be agreed and set out through a council-endorsed policy. So there could be a general indication of support for that concept in the policy, but how that would be then worked through in practice might need to be agreed separately.
I have a question just in relation to, I know that it's probably in here somewhere and I have tried to skim through it and find it, but the council's had a pretty tough view on intrastate and interstate travel, and I'm just wanting to clarify what the approval would be for travel given the costs involved. Would this still require that if there is a travel proposal that would need to come to council for approval?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's on the top of page 3, and we've got there that if the CEO can approve training requests from elected members provided it relates to training, development or a conference within Western Australia, and then underneath that, any requests for interstate travel or overseas travel would be referred to council.
So the CEO can approve trips to Broome or something like that. Okay. Bunbury, okay. Yep. Oh, interesting. Okay. Any other questions on this? No. Okay, moving on. The next item is Local Government Statutory Compliance Audit Return 8.12. No questions? 8.13, Report and Minutes of the Audit Committee meeting held on the 3rd of March 2020. Any questions? Councillor Loden.
Just a query on timeframes associated with addressing the extreme and high risks listed in the attachments to the Audit Committee minutes.
Through you, Mayor Cole, we had a discussion about that at the Audit Committee executive meeting later this week to make some changes to that risk register, which was discussed at the Audit Committee, and we'll re-present that draft register to the Audit Committee meeting in a month and a half's time.
On the 5th of May.
Yeah, the 5th of May.
Just a follow-up question. Will COVID-19 appear on the risk register, and is there been some planning towards risk mitigation?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes to both those questions.
Okay, I'll follow up with a request for an update to Council through some way because that's relatively urgent. Any other further questions on the audit minutes? Okay. CEO, what is the status of 8.14 results of the Local Government Professionals Performance Excellence Program 2018-19?
Through you, Mayor Cole, our intention is to publish that report on the website. We're doing some further work on what our more specific actions will be in response to some of the findings at the report in terms of how we can improve our service delivery.
Sorry, is this report coming to Council for Tuesday next week?
No, through you, Mayor Cole, I've withdrawn it and we'll present it in April.
Thank you. Any questions on 8.15 Information Bulletin? Okay. The remaining item that we have to deal with is 7.5 Major Public Artwork Commission Artist and Design Selection. Does anyone have any questions in relation to the confidential items that would cause us to go behind closed doors? No questions? Anyone has any questions relevant to the open item? Councillor Gondaszewski?
This may send us behind closed doors. I guess I just wanted to talk about the location selection, and I just would be grateful for some advice from the Executive Director whether questions around location selection would be something that might need to be confidential. I wouldn't think so, but... Okay, so my understanding is that a list of possible locations was put forward against the criteria in relation to the artwork being an entry statement, access, land ownership and access to power. Of the list that was provided, I don't believe World Square was included on that list. Can I just get that confirmed? Happy for that to be on notice. And then also just a question in relation to, of the sites that ended up being included in the expression of interest, what are the distances of these sites from entry points at Vincent? There you go.
That's not 10 o'clock.
Go to bed. I believe that the Arts Advisory Group discussed the terminology relating to the word entry statement and appeared to determine that they felt that town centres would fit that brief, but I don't believe that any town centres were included in the eventual list. And the minutes of the Arts Advisory Group don't provide much clarity on how the list provided by Infrastructure and Environment was whittled down to those presented in the EOI, and just requesting some additional information on that. And just also to confirm that the EOI didn't mention the term entry statement. And then also just to follow up in relation to how the requirement in the EOI that the artwork be site-specific relates to the strategic objective for the artwork that, as set out in the Arts Development Plan, that the artwork is an entry statement. I guess with particular reference to my question about the distances of the sites from the entry points to Vincent, and just whether we can please, as a confidential attachment, get the assessment criteria, scoring notes and submissions that were used, that were received as part of the earlier EOI. I note that we've received the 3 that moved to concept development. However, this is an unusual tender procurement process, and I guess I'm used to seeing all the submissions, so that'd be great if I could get that too.
So just to confirm, I'll provide the this information in the briefing notes. Yep.
Councillors, just one further question to that. Just in terms of the panel membership, it does talk about the sort of composition, but it would be good to know just how many Arts Advisory Group members, how many staff members, the expertise that sort of came into that group in a little bit more detail. And I also was interested that it didn't appear that there was a written component of the EOI, but in terms of like actually a written component to outline the concept or the theme or the scale of the artwork doesn't seem to have been part of that, and didn't seem to be until after the artists were selected that that information came forward. I just wanted some clarification around the sort of written information that was provided, whether it was broad or whether it actually outlined the concept for the artwork.
Great. I'll come back to you on that. Thank you.
Are there any further questions? Okay. That concludes the meeting for this evening. We've managed to make it to I think that's about 4 minutes past 10, so quite a long one this evening. Thank you very much to everyone who's hung in there on the live stream and